The narrative around Evander Holyfield's health has shifted after close associates revealed what's been happening behind closed doors. While fans have speculated for years about his slower movements and public appearances, the reality of his daily life paints a very different picture of his retirement. Evander Holyfield was born on October 19, 1962, in the mill town of Atmore, Alabama. The youngest of 9 children, born from a different father than his siblings, his family later moved to Atlanta, Georgia, where he was raised in the Bowen Homes housing projects. If you want to understand how a man ends up in a 54-square-foot mansion with a bowling alley and a 135-seat movie theater, you have to start here, in the cramped corridors of a federal housing development, where violence was the ambient noise of daily life. Bowen Homes was rife with crime, with police reports showing 168 violent crimes in just a 6-month window, including 5 murders. This was the world young Evander woke up in every morning. The projects were not a backdrop. They were the forge. Everything that made Evander Holyfield into the fighter the world would come to know: the relentlessness, the refusal to stay down, the almost supernatural belief in his own ability to recover. All of it was hammered out in those streets. Holyfield began boxing in a program at the Warren Memorial Boys Club in Southeast Atlanta. He was 7 years old, a small boy in a neighborhood that consumed children who didn't find something to hold on to. Boxing became the thing he held on to. It became the only thing that mattered. Holyfield describes himself as a physical late bloomer. Upon graduating from Fulton High School in 1980, he was only 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed only 147 pounds. There was nothing physically imposing about the teenager who walked out of Fulton High. Nobody looked at him and saw a future world champion, but size was never the point. He began boxing at age 7 and won the Boys Club boxing tournament. At 13, he qualified to compete in his first Junior Olympics. By age 15, Holyfield became the Southeastern Regional Champion, winning this tournament and the Best Boxer Award. His crowning amateur achievement was earning a bronze medal at the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics in the light heavyweight division. A boy from the Bowen Homes projects, a boy who grew up watching his mother stretch whatever money came in across 9 children. Standing on the Olympic stage, representing the United States of America, his amateur career culminated with a bronze medal at the 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles, despite a controversial disqualification in the semifinals. The disqualification in the semis remains controversial to this day. Most ringside observers believed Holyfield had won that bout, that the disqualification for a late hit was a judgment call that went the wrong way. But Evander Holyfield was not a man who let injustice become his story. He took the bronze and he turned pro. He turned pro later that same year, 1984, and the professional boxing world was about to get its first real introduction to the man who would become a 4-time heavyweight champion of the world. Holyfield turned professional shortly after the Olympics, making his debut against Lionel Bayarm in New York City. His early professional fights showcased his potential, leading to his first world title in 1986, when he defeated Dwight Muhammad Cowie for the WBA Cruiserweight Championship. That Cowie fight was a war, a 15-round split decision that the Ring magazine called the best cruiserweight bout of the 1980s. Holyfield went to places in that fight that most boxers never visit, and he came out with the belt. That was the moment the boxing world understood who this man was. His initial success came in the light heavyweight division, but he truly became a boxing star when he moved up to cruiserweight and claimed the undisputed championship. And then, with the entire cruiserweight division conquered, Holyfield did what almost no one thought was feasible. He looked up at the heavyweight division, the division of giants, the division that had been ruled for years by an untamable force named Mike Tyson, and he decided to move up. The heavyweight division in the late 1980s had one name. That name was Mike Tyson. Tyson was not merely a fighter. He was a phenomenon, a force of nature that had dismantled every opponent placed before him, with a terrifying combination of speed, power, and psychological dominance. Fighters were beaten before they stepped into the ring, defeated by their own fear before a single punch was thrown. When people heard the name Tyson, they did not think about the boxing match. They thought about the aftermath. Evander Holyfield looked at all of that and decided it wasn't his problem. In 1990, he shocked the world by defeating Buster Douglas to claim the undisputed heavyweight championship. This victory opened the floodgates for massive purses. His fights became must-see events. drawing millions of pay-per-view buys and selling out arenas worldwide. The undisputed heavyweight championship. Every belt. At once. The boy from Bowen Holmes had become the most dominant heavyweight on the planet, and the money that came with that dominance was staggering. Over the years, he amassed estimated fight purses totaling around $230 million. These earnings include guaranteed salaries, pay-per-view revenue shares, and sponsorship deals tied to his high-profile matches. Think about what that number means in the context of where Evander started. A child from federally subsidized housing, who wore someone else's hand-me-down shoes, who shared a bedroom with siblings in a crime-soaked project. That child was on his way to accumulating a fortune that most people could not spend in 10 lifetimes. The arc of his rise was so steep, so dramatic, that it almost demanded an equally dramatic fall. But before the fall, there was the full summit. And the summit had a name, and that name was Tyson. By the mid-1990s, the whole boxing world was waiting for the fight that seemed inevitable, Holyfield against Tyson. The question that everyone in boxing was asking was simple. Was Evander Holyfield brave enough or skilled enough to step in there with the most feared fighter alive? The answer came on November 9, 1996. In the first fight, with Holyfield winning by TKO, he earned approximately $12 million. But the dollar figure was almost an afterthought. What mattered was the result. Holyfield dropped Mike Tyson. He stopped him. He did what every other heavyweight had failed to do. What most of the boxing world had thought was impossible. He walked into the MGM Grand Garden Arena in Las Vegas and beat Iron Mike Tyson by TKO in the 11th round. The shock waves rippled through the entire sport. The heavily favored Tyson lost to Holyfield via TKO in the 11th round. Holyfield became the heavyweight champion for the third time, 3 times. The only boxer since Muhammad Ali to hold the heavyweight title 3 times. And there was more to come. The rematch was set, the world watched, and what happened next became one of the most indelible moments in sports history. Not because of the boxing, but because of what happened to Evander Holyfield's ear. June 28, 1997. Las Vegas, Nevada. The MGM Grand Garden Arena. The night of the rematch between Evander Holyfield and Mike Tyson was one of the most anticipated events in boxing history. Pay-per-view orders shattered records. The air inside the arena was electric with anticipation. This was the biggest stage in the sport, and both men were ready to make history. What unfolded was history, though not in the way anyone expected. In the rematch, Tyson was disqualified for biting off a portion of Holyfield's ear, which was later reattached. Stop and sit with that for a moment. In the middle of a championship bout, in front of millions of people watching around the world, Mike Tyson bit off a piece of Evander Holyfield's ear. The referee stopped the fight. Chaos erupted in the arena. The bite fight became instantly iconic. The most talked about moment in boxing, perhaps in all of sports, for years to come. And Evander Holyfield walked out of that arena, not just with his ear reattached, but with a fight purse that illustrated exactly how much the world valued watching him perform. Evander earned $35 million for the fight, while Tyson earned an estimated $30 million. This equated to Holyfield earning roughly $47 million in total from both Tyson fights combined. $47 million from 2 nights of work. The boy from Bowen Holmes was now, by any measurement, extraordinarily wealthy. At his peak, Evander's net worth easily topped $100 million. $100 million. The kind of wealth that, managed correctly, could sustain a family across generations. The kind of wealth that, mismanaged, could disappear entirely within a decade. And Evander Holyfield was about to find out which kind of wealth his was. There are 2 ways to read Evander Holyfield's career arc from this point. The first way is the inspiring one, the story of a champion who kept competing, who kept pushing, who refused to walk away while he still believed he had something to give. The second way is the one that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore as the years pile up. The story of a man who needed the money, who kept stepping through the ropes, not because he was chasing greatness, but because the bills were stacking up faster than the income was coming in. The truth, as is usually the case, is somewhere in the middle of both readings. The Mike Tyson fights in 1996 and 1997 represent the financial peak of Holyfield's career. The first bout earned him around $35 million, while the infamous Bite Fight rematch brought in approximately $35 million more. When Tyson bit off a piece of Holyfield's ear during that second fight, it became one of the most talked about moments in sports history. After those two fights, the earning curve began, slowly at first, then more rapidly, to trend downward. But the spending was just getting started. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Holyfield remained a top draw. His trilogy with Riddick Bowe, battles with Lennox Lewis, and numerous other championship fights generated substantial income. Individual purses often reached $20 million or more for major bouts, with endorsement deals adding millions more to his annual income. On paper, the money was still flowing, but the infrastructure around that money, the decisions being made about where it went, who managed it, what it was invested in, was beginning to show the first signs of fracture. Before we get to the fracture, we need to sit with the early controversy that very nearly ended everything before the Tyson fights ever happened. Because there is a chapter in Evander Holyfield's story that gets overlooked in most tellings. A chapter that could have cut his career in half and cost him every one of those enormous paydays that came in the mid to late 1990s. It is the chapter of the heart. Following his defeat to Michael Moorer in 1994, the renowned boxer Evander Holyfield retired abruptly when doctors identified a heart condition in the aftermath of the fight. He had just lost his heavyweight title on a 12-round decision. He went to the hospital, and what the doctors found when they examined him changed everything. The condition was diagnosed as a non-compliant left ventricle, or stiff heart, which prevented sufficient oxygen from being pumped to muscles and tissues. A stiff heart, a condition that affects the heart's ability to fill properly, to process blood efficiently, to sustain the kind of extreme physical output required of a heavyweight boxing champion. Doctors discovered another problem with his heart. A test at Crawford Long Hospital of Emory University revealed a tiny hole in the boxer's heart. The medical term for the condition is atrial septal defect. This is something he was born with, said Holyfield's personal physician, Dr. Ronald Stevens. Born with it. Which means he had been boxing his whole career with a structural defect in his heart. Every fight, every round, every savage exchange, all of it with a heart that was not operating at full capacity. The medical establishment was clear about what this meant. Dr. Elias Ghanem, the only physician on the Nevada State Athletic Commission, was outspoken in his desire to see Holyfield retire. After it was revealed, he suffered from a heart defect in 1994. His influence was such that even after Holyfield ended a year-long retirement and announced he would fight Ray Mercer in May of 1995, the bout was virtually banned in Nevada and was instead held in Atlantic City. The Nevada Commission, the most powerful boxing regulatory body in the world, essentially said Evander Holyfield should never box again. That was the institutional position. And Holyfield's response to that position was, in a word, defiance. He claimed he had been healed. Less than a year later, Holyfield shocked even the anything-goes boxing crowd by proclaiming he had been cured of his heart problem by a faith healer in Philadelphia. A faith healer. In a sport defined by cold, hard physical reality, by punches thrown and absorbed, by blood and bruising, and the relentless arithmetic of rounds, Evander Holyfield stood before the world and said a man of God had laid hands on him, and the stiff heart was gone. The medical community was skeptical, to put it gently. Dr. Ghanem's response was simple: "I don't believe it. It just doesn't make sense. No doctor will ever tell you someone can be cured by a faith healer." But faith was not something Evander Holyfield treated as peripheral. It was central to everything. A year later, Holyfield miraculously cleared all the tests and returned to the ring. After claiming that a faith healer helped him recover, Holyfield came back to fight and win. A year later, in 1995, the tests came back clean. Whatever had shown up before was no longer registering on the instruments. Whether it was divine intervention, a misdiagnosis, or simply a body that had healed with rest, Evander Holyfield was back. And the Tyson fights, the $47 million, the summit of the sport, all of that still lay ahead. The story of the heart diagnosis has a wrinkle that adds another layer. Years later, Holyfield would tell a different version of the events surrounding the cardiac scare. He remained adamant when asked about the allegation put forth by the Nevada State Athletic Commission, blaming it on too much morphine. His account was that after the loss to Moorer, he was administered large doses of morphine for pain management, and those doses distorted the cardiac readings, that the heart condition was never real. It was a misreading of data corrupted by medication. Holyfield said, "You see, the thing is, when they told me I had a heart attack, they gave me too much morphine. They gave me too much morphine, and that was the whole problem, because I didn't have a heart problem. They gave me too much morphine." Because of this diagnosis, Holyfield also had to retire from the sport for some time. Whether his account is accurate, or whether the faith healer narrative is the more truthful one, or whether both contain elements of truth, what this episode reveals is something essential about how Evander Holyfield processed the world. He operated from a place of total conviction. When doctors told him his career was over, he didn't accept it. When the Nevada Commission shut doors, he found another door. When his body seemed to be setting limits, his faith pushed past them. This disposition, the refusal to accept any ceiling, was what made him a champion. It was also what made the financial collapse, when it came, so devastating. Because the same mentality that refused to accept physical limits also refused to accept financial ones. By the late 1990s, the architecture of Evander Holyfield's lifestyle was fully constructed. It was vast, elaborate, and extraordinarily expensive to maintain. The Tyson purses had filled the coffers to overflowing, and the money felt inexhaustible. This feeling that the money would always be there, that the next fight would always bring in enough to cover whatever had been spent, was the most dangerous feeling Evander Holyfield ever had. More dangerous than facing Mike Tyson. More dangerous than boxing with a hole in his heart. The centerpiece of this lifestyle was the mansion, the 54,000 square foot home, located on Evander Holyfield Highway, had 109 rooms, including 17 bathrooms, 3 kitchens, and a bowling alley. Not a bowling lane, a bowling alley. The address itself, Evander Holyfield Highway, tells you everything about the scale of what was being constructed here. This was not a home. This was a monument. His former accountant, Sam Gaynor, said of the home, "That's his trophy, his symbol of success." The mansion, which spans 54,000 square feet and sits on 234 acres, features 2 bowling alleys and a 135-seat movie theater. The estate was costing Holyfield more than $1 million a year to maintain. $1 million per year just to keep the lights on and the grass cut. Not the mortgage, not the property taxes, just the ongoing cost of running a building that could comfortably house a small village. At the height of his earning power, that figure was manageable. But earning power in boxing is never permanent. The fights kept coming through the early 2000s. But the financial landscape was shifting. The purses that had once touched $35 million were declining. The competition was fierce, and Holyfield was no longer the unambiguous dominant force he had been in the mid-1990s. There were losses to Lennox Lewis, to Riddick Bowe, to fighters who, a decade earlier, would never have been considered in the same conversation. In 1999, Holyfield received $15 million in his loss to Lennox Lewis, followed by $5 million against John Ruiz in 2000, and $5 million against Hasim Rahman in 2002. The arc is unmistakable. $35 million, $12 million, $15 million, $5 million. The numbers are falling, but the mansion still cost $1 million a year to maintain. The children still needed support. The entourage still needed paying. The businesses still needed funding, and none of the mechanisms that might have been catching this disparity, the accountants, the advisors, the attorneys, were apparently raising alarms loudly enough for Holyfield to hear. On December 20, 2008, he fought the WBA heavyweight champion Nikolai Valuev for a paycheck of $600,000, the lowest amount he had ever received for a championship fight. $600,000. for a World Heavyweight Championship fight, for a man who had made $35 million in a single evening 11 years earlier. The gap between those two numbers tells the story of the entire second half of his career, and it tells it with brutal precision. The empire was crumbling, and the man at its center had not yet fully reckoned with what that meant. The people around Evander Holyfield during this period deserve scrutiny, because one of the central questions in understanding what really happened to him is not just about his own choices. It is about the quality of counsel surrounding those choices. People who were paid to give advice, who had financial incentives tied to the athlete's continued spending, who found it easier to enable than to confront. His former accountant, Sam Gaynor, described Holyfield's fundamental vulnerability. He thinks everyone is as trustworthy as he is. That's the shame of it. That sentence is one of the most revealing things ever said about Evander Holyfield as a person and as a financial victim. He operated from a framework of trust. He believed that the people around him shared his values, his integrity, his commitment. He thought that if he was loyal to them, they would be loyal to him in return. The boxing world and the financial world built around boxing was not that kind of place. Holyfield broke with many of his past associates, such as his longtime personal lawyer Jim Thomas. They parted ways in 2003, as Thomas, like many once in Holyfield's camp, advised the fighter he should end his boxing career. The people who told him the truth, who said the career was over, who said the spending needed to stop, tended to get pushed out of the circle, and the people who replaced them tended to be people who said yes. Yes, the house is fine. Yes, the business is a good idea. Yes, you should keep fighting. Yes, the money will come back. There is also the matter of the businesses, because Holyfield's financial demise was not simply a story of excessive personal spending, though that was certainly a factor. It was also a story of entrepreneurial ambition outrunning entrepreneurial judgment. Sizable investments in a recording label and a Christian television network, the Black Family Channel based in Atlanta, both soured. These were not small ventures undertaken without conviction. They were projects Holyfield threw himself into with the same total commitment he brought to everything else in his life. The record label alone reportedly consumed millions. He believed in the music industry the same way he believed in his own ability to win championship bouts, through total commitment and force of will. But businesses do not respond to willpower the way opponents do. It requires people in the room who will tell you when the numbers don't work, who will terminate ventures before they become sinkholes. Holyfield appears not to have had enough of those people at the critical moments, and so the record label bled money until it was shut down, and the television network followed a similar path. Then there were the investments in real estate, in ventures that promised returns they could not deliver, in opportunities that looked compelling on paper and collapsed in practice. Taken together, stacked on top of the mansion's running costs, the child support obligations, the divorce settlements, the declining fight purses, they formed a weight that even a man of Holyfield's extraordinary resilience could not carry indefinitely. The personal dimension of Evander Holyfield's financial story is one that requires honesty and sensitivity in equal measure, because the numbers attached to his family life are not simply cold financial figures. They represent children, relationships, and a set of obligations that any person with his values would feel bound to honor. But they also represent one of the most significant drains on his accumulated wealth. And to understand what happened to the money, you have to understand the full scope of what he was committed to supporting. Holyfield has been married 4 times and has 11 children. 11 children by multiple women across multiple relationships and marriages. 3 divorce settlements quickly slashed his net worth in half, along with child support payments to 11 children by 6 different women. The mathematics of that situation, even without the mansion, even without the failed businesses, even without the declining fight purses, is daunting. Divorce settlements in the tens of millions. Child support payments that at their peak ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars per month. 3 separate sets of legal proceedings, each with its own attorneys, its own negotiations, its own outcomes. The children themselves, and this is important, were not the problem. Holyfield loved his children. His faith demanded that he care for them. His identity as a man was bound up in providing for them. But the financial architecture surrounding that provision, The multiple simultaneous support agreements, the legal battles when payments were missed, the public spectacle of a world champion being taken to court over money owed to his own children. That architecture was unsustainable at the pace it was accumulating. The child support battles became public, and they were not flattering. Holyfield's $10 million estate in suburban Atlanta was under foreclosure. The mother of one of his children was suing for unpaid child support, and a Utah consulting company had gone to court claiming the boxer failed to pay for more than $500,000 in landscaping. All of that surfaced at essentially the same moment. June 2008, painting a picture of a man whose financial life had descended into chaos simultaneously on multiple fronts. The child support case involved Holyfield's son, whose mother, Toy Irvin, was initially awarded $2,000 a month in support. $2,000 a month for a man who had earned $230 million in his career. The attorney representing Toy Irvin was unsparing in his assessment of the situation. He said, "This is such a small amount given the scope of what he has. If Evander Holyfield can get away with it, anybody can. There are guys making $15,000 a year who go to jail for missing a $100 payment." The gap between those two realities, the man who made $230 million and the man who was in arrears on a $2,000 monthly payment, is the defining paradox of Evander Holyfield's financial story. And it is a paradox that would only sharpen as the years went on, and the full scale of the collapse became impossible to ignore. Holyfield's public response to the initial reports was measured and, in its way, revealing. He did not immediately acknowledge the depth of the crisis. He did not announce a plan to address the debts and the mounting legal pressures. Instead, he drew a distinction. "I'm not broke," he told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. "I'm just not liquid." That is the kind of thing a man says when he is not yet ready to accept what is happening. Illiquid is a financial term for assets that cannot be quickly converted to cash. But what it also describes in this context is a man who has tied up his wealth in a property that is consuming $1 million a year, in businesses that are not generating returns, in obligations that are compounding with interest. I do feel kind of sad because things have always been positive, and now everybody wants to jump on me like I'm the worst person in the world, and I went out and blew all my money. There is real pain in that statement. This was a man who had spent 30 years building a reputation for discipline, for work ethic, for unimpeachable commitment to his craft. The narrative that he had squandered everything struck him as a betrayal, as though the public was choosing the most reductive reading of his story rather than the full one. But the full story, as it would emerge over the following years, was more complicated and more damaging than even those 2008 headlines suggested. The foreclosure was not the end of the crisis. It was the public announcement of a crisis that had been building for a long time, one that would culminate in a bankruptcy filing that stripped away any remaining ambiguity about the scale of what had been lost. By 2012, the numbers were impossible to argue with. In 2012, he filed for bankruptcy, revealing debts estimated at nearly $10 million. The mansion was already gone. After being foreclosed, the house was sold at public auction for $7.5 million. Evander owed a bank more than twice that amount for the house's mortgage. In 2014, Rick Ross bought the house for $5.4 million. The mansion that had once been his trophy, his symbol of success, was now a property that a rapper purchased for a fraction of what it had cost to build and maintain. The address still reads Evander Holyfield Highway. The man himself was no longer at that address. In mid-2012, the Georgia Department of Human Services claimed Evander owed $372,097.40 to his daughter Imani Holyfield and requested that a judge order Holyfield to be imprisoned. Imprisonment over child support. For a man who had once held every heavyweight title simultaneously, the trajectory from that peak to this moment, from undisputed champion of the world to a man a judge was being asked to imprison for non-payment of child support, represents one of the most dramatic falls in sports history. And yet the fighting continued, because the bills did not stop arriving when the big purses stopped. So Evander Holyfield did what Evander Holyfield had always done when the situation demanded it. He went back to work. The only work he knew. The later years of his fighting career are difficult to watch if you know the context. In the latter years of his career, he earned a $600,000 payday for his loss to Nikolai Valuev in 2008. Then came the fights against opponents who, in any honest assessment, should not have been in the same ring as a man of Holyfield's legacy. Fights in places that would never have hosted him in his prime. Fights against fighters who could not have gotten through his front door in the late 1990s. In August 2005, it had been reported that the New York State Athletic Commission had banned Evander Holyfield from boxing in New York due to diminishing skills. Despite the fact that Holyfield had passed a battery of medical tests, the commission saw what the rest of the sporting world was beginning to acknowledge: that the man who had stepped through the ropes against Tyson, Bowe, Lewis, and Foreman was no longer the same fighter. The skills that had elevated him to the apex of the sport were diminishing, being worn away by time and accumulated punishment, and the relentless physical arithmetic of a career that had spanned 3 decades. Evander also returned in 2021 for an exhibition match against former MMA fighter Vitor Belfort, earning $500,000. He lost in the first round by technical knockout, and he likely took the fight solely due to his financial issues at the time. 58 years old, against an active mixed martial artist. In 2021, 37 years after his professional debut, that fight, more than perhaps any other single event in his post-peak career, illustrated the degree to which financial pressure had overridden every other consideration. Holyfield was not out there at 58 because he believed he could still compete at the highest level. He was out there because the money had to come from somewhere. The question that haunts every examination of this story is, where exactly did $230 million go? And the answer is not a simple one. It is not one villain, one bad investment, one catastrophic decision. It is a pattern. A convergence of factors that, operating simultaneously, produced a total that dwarfs any individual component. His financial troubles stemmed from a combination of poor investments, lifestyle expenses, and legal issues, including unpaid child support and back taxes. The mansion over $1 million per year in maintenance costs, year after year, for roughly a decade. The mortgage. A $10 million loan that eventually triggered foreclosure proceedings. When Washington Mutual came calling, the businesses, a record label, a television network venture, and multiple other enterprises that consumed capital without generating the returns needed to sustain them. The divorces. 3 marriages, each ending in settlements that came with significant financial consequences. The child support. Obligations running into the hundreds of thousands per month at their peak for 11 children across multiple households. The entourage, the trainers, the managers, the attorneys, the advisors, the hangers-on who were all paid from the same well. That was not being replenished at the rate it was being emptied. And underneath all of it, running as the deepest structural flaw in the entire edifice, was the belief that it would never run out. A person can earn extraordinary amounts during peak years and still end up with far less later in life because of spending, debt, taxes, legal obligations, and costly lifestyle choices. Holyfield is not the first athlete this has happened to. He will not be the last, but few stories capture the magnitude of the gap between what was earned and what remained as starkly as his does. The numbers are the final verdict on part 1, and they are unambiguous. Holyfield earned around $230 million during his career, without even adjusting for inflation. In 2008, he lost his longtime home to foreclosure. He was forced to sell off most of his assets to pay down various debts, from a peak net worth that reportedly touched $200 million to a 2026 figure that most estimates place at exactly $1 million. That is the headline. That is the number that makes people stop scrolling, stop whatever they are doing, and ask the question that forms the title of this video. But the headline is only the surface. The story underneath it, the mansion on Evander Holyfield Highway, the faith healer in Philadelphia, the child support courtrooms, the 11 children and 4 marriages, the record label, the yes men, the declining purses, the 58-year-old man stepping through the ropes against a former MMA champion. That story is richer and more complicated and more human than the headline allows. And it is a story that is still unfolding because Evander Holyfield is still alive, still present, still making his way through a world that has not always treated him fairly, and doing it with the same fundamental quality that defined everything he was in the ring: resilience. Pure, undecorated, inexhaustible resilience. There is one image, above all others, that crystallizes what happened to Evander Holyfield. It is not a fight poster or a trophy cabinet. It is not a court filing or a bankruptcy document. It is a driveway, the driveway to a 54,000 square foot estate on 234 acres of land in Fairburn, Georgia, where a road sign at the entrance reads Evander Holyfield Highway, and where the building at the end of that driveway contains 109 rooms, 2 bowling alleys, 3 kitchens, 17 bathrooms, and a movie theater with 135 seats. That building, the most symbolic object in the entire story of what happened to Evander Holyfield, tells you everything you need to know about the collision between extraordinary success and the psychology of invincibility. To understand how the mansion became a catastrophe, you have to understand how it became a dream. The estate, worth an estimated $20 million, has a bowling alley and movie theater. This was not built as an investment property. It was not conceived as a smart real estate play. His former accountant, Sam Gaynor, said of the home, "That's his trophy, his symbol of success." Think about what a trophy represents to a man like Holyfield, a physical, tangible, permanent statement that he had been here, that he had achieved something, that the kid from Bowen Homes projects had not only escaped poverty but had transcended it on a scale that defied comprehension. The mansion was not irrational. It was deeply human. The problem with trophies is that they don't generate income. They consume it. And this particular trophy consumed it at a rate that, even at the height of Holyfield's earning power, was extraordinary. The mansion was 54,000 square feet and cost over $1 million annually to maintain. That is not the mortgage payment. That is not the property tax. That is the cost of keeping the lights on, the grass cut, the HVAC systems running, the pool maintained, the staff paid, and the 109 rooms in a state that befitted a world heavyweight champion. $1 million a year in running costs, year after year, for a building that was a statement rather than an asset. The mortgage itself was its own weight. Holyfield defaulted on a $10 million loan to Washington Mutual Bank, which would eventually auction off his home on the courthouse steps. Washington Mutual Bank, the institution that held the mortgage on Evander Holyfield's dream, would itself become one of the most famous bank failures in American financial history during the 2008 financial crisis. But before it collapsed, it came after Holyfield's estate with everything at its disposal. The foreclosure proceedings that began in mid-2008 were not sudden. They were the end point of a process that had been building for years. As the gap between income and expenditure widened and the reserves that had once cushioned that gap disappeared, a legal notice that ran in a small newspaper in Georgia said Holyfield's estate would be auctioned off at public outcry to the highest bidder for cash at the Fayette County Courthouse. At public outcry. There is something almost theatrical about that phrase, as though the legal system itself understood the drama of what was happening. A man who had been cheered at full volume in arenas around the world, who had stepped into the ring against the most feared heavyweights on the planet without flinching, was now having his home auctioned at the courthouse steps. The auction itself produced a price that underscored the impossibility of the situation. After being foreclosed, the house was sold at public auction for $7.5 million. Evander owed the bank more than twice that amount for the house's mortgage. A property that his accountant had valued at $20 million, fetched $7.5 million on the courthouse steps. He owed more than $14 million on the mortgage. The arithmetic of that transaction, selling for $7.5 million, what cost $10 million to mortgage, on a building estimated at $20 million, is a masterclass in how catastrophically underwater a property situation can become. The mansion's story has an element that brings it from the realm of financial mismanagement into something darker, something that involves family, trust, and betrayal. The kind of betrayal that is particularly corrosive because it comes from someone whose loyalty should have been unconditional. Reports have emerged, including Holyfield's own statements in interviews, that a family member, specifically a sister, had illegally taken out a second mortgage on the property without his knowledge. According to reports, Evander lost an enormous amount due to his sister illegally demanding a mortgage on his mansion. If true, and it remains an allegation, rather than a proven legal finding, this would represent one of the most devastating dimensions of the entire story, because it would mean that the financial collapse of the mansion was not entirely the product of Holyfield's own choices. It would mean that someone he trusted, someone with access to his financial affairs, had used that access to extract value from his most significant asset in a way that he did not authorize and did not know about. And it would mean that by the time the full picture emerged, the damage was already baked in. This allegation is consistent with a broader pattern in Holyfield's story, the pattern of people around him making choices that cost him, of trust being extended to those who did not deserve it, of the same open-handed generosity that made him beloved becoming a mechanism for exploitation. His accountant had warned him about it. The people who watched from the outside could see it. But Holyfield, whose faith in people was as deep as his faith in God, could not bring himself to erect the walls that might have protected him. The geography of the estate matters to this story too. Fairburn, Georgia, just south of the Fulton County line, southwest of Atlanta, a community that sits in the orbit of a city that made Evander Holyfield a legend. The road that leads to the property was officially named Evander Holyfield Highway, not by Holyfield himself, by the local government, as a tribute to a man who had brought honor to the region, who had represented Georgia on the world stage, who had emerged from the housing projects of Atlanta to become one of the most famous athletes alive. That naming is significant because it captures the moment when the gap between the public narrative and the private reality was at its widest. Evander Holyfield Highway was named and signed while the finances were already in distress, while the mortgage was already compounding, while the businesses were already losing money, while the child support battles were already making their way through the courts. The name on the road sign and the reality at the address it led to were two entirely different stories. There is a poetry to what happened next that is almost too on the nose to be true. In 2014, Rick Ross bought the house for $5.4 million. Rick Ross, the rapper, the man who built his artistic persona around images of extraordinary wealth and power and opulence, purchased Evander Holyfield's former trophy, the physical manifestation of a champion's dreams, for $5.4 million. The road sign still reads Evander Holyfield Highway. The building at the end of it belongs to someone else. The mansion was the most visible symbol of the financial collapse, but it was not the only asset that disappeared. The bankruptcy proceedings of 2012 triggered a cascade of auctions and liquidations that stripped away the remaining material markers of Holyfield's era of dominance. His possessions, the cars, the memorabilia, the trophies, the artifacts of a 3-decade career, were put up for sale. Many of his prized possessions, including his Olympic bronze medal, were sold at auction to cover debts and obligations. His Olympic bronze medal, the object that represented his first major achievement, the moment a kid from Bowen Homes stood on the Olympic stage at the 1984 Los Angeles Games and showed the world what he was made of. That medal, sold at auction, going to some collector who would display it on a shelf, without any of the context, any of the story, any of the meaning it carried when it was draped around a young man's neck at the Coliseum in Los Angeles. If the mansion's foreclosure was the public declaration of the crisis, the sale of the Olympic bronze medal was its private heartbreak. The fleet of cars also had to go. Reports from the period of the financial implosion describe a collection of vehicles that numbered over 100 at its peak. Not quite the level of a serious collector's estate, but a fleet that reflected the same philosophy as the mansion. More is more, and the money will always be there. When the money wasn't there anymore, the cars went, the memorabilia went, the jewelry went, the businesses went. Everything that could be converted to cash was converted to cash, because the creditors needed paying and the well had run dry. It is worth pausing here to examine the mechanics of how $230 million disappears. because the instinctive response to hearing that number is disbelief. How does a man earn $230 million and end up with $1 million? What kind of spending is even possible on that scale? The answer requires understanding not just Holyfield's specific situation, but the broader financial architecture that surrounds elite athletes in general and boxers in particular. A person can earn extraordinary amounts during peak years and still end up with far less later in life because of spending, debt, taxes, legal obligations, and costly lifestyle choices. Start with taxes. Federal income tax on the highest earnings in the years when Holyfield was at his peak would have consumed roughly 40% of the gross figure. So the $230 million in career earnings becomes something closer to $140 million after federal taxes. Then add state taxes. Then add the mandatory financial obligations, management fees, promotional splits, trainer cuts, corner fees. A professional boxer in Holyfield's era might realistically retain somewhere between 50 and 60 cents of every dollar earned. By the time the immediate financial obligations around the fight itself are settled, that still leaves an enormous sum. But it is a sum that was being distributed across multiple households, multiple businesses, multiple legal proceedings, and a lifestyle infrastructure that consumed capital at a rate that the declining fight purses could not sustain. Holyfield faced severe financial troubles despite earning over $300 million during his boxing career. This is primarily due to excessive spending, poor investment decisions, and mounting obligations, such as child support. The figure of $300 million in some estimates is itself a reflection of total gross receipts, not net earnings. But even that gross figure is almost incomprehensibly large when placed next to the $1 million that remains today. The men who were supposed to protect the money also bear examination. Because Holyfield did not manage his own finances, nobody at that level does. He had accountants, attorneys, financial advisors, business managers. He had, at various points, some of the most experienced and well-connected professionals in the sports finance world working on his behalf. And yet the result was bankruptcy, which raises the question, what exactly were they doing? Holyfield's former accountant, Sam Gaynor, who was fired by the former world champion, said he had advised his client to sell the estate, or at least some of the property. Gaynor had seen the numbers. He understood what was happening. He told Holyfield what needed to happen. Reduce the overhead, sell the property that was consuming capital, faster than any investment could replenish it. And Holyfield's response was to fire him. As Gaynor noted, to attack that house in any way or suggest he get rid of it, that's just not going to fly with him. This is a pattern seen repeatedly in the financial collapses of elite athletes. The advisors who tell the hard truths get replaced by advisors who tell easier ones. The people who push back get pushed out. The people who stay are the ones who have learned to frame everything in terms of possibility rather than risk, who know that their continued employment depends on their continued support of whatever the athlete wants to do. And so the hard conversations never happen, and the decisions that might have changed the trajectory never get made. And the crisis that might have been averted is instead allowed to compound year after year until it can no longer be managed. The parallel to Mike Tyson is inevitable and instructive. Tyson, like Holyfield, earned hundreds of millions during his boxing career. Tyson, like Holyfield, declared bankruptcy. Tyson, like Holyfield, built a lifestyle of extraordinary excess, a mansion, an entourage, exotic animals, multiple marriages, and all the other apparatus of a life lived without financial guardrails. Tyson's story has become almost a parable in discussions of athlete financial literacy, cited in business schools and financial planning seminars as the example of how not to manage generational wealth. But Holyfield's story is, in some ways, more instructive than Tyson's, precisely because Holyfield's public image was so different. Tyson's excesses were, from the beginning, visible and notorious. The persona he projected was one of unchecked power and appetite. When Tyson went broke, nobody was entirely surprised. But Holyfield, disciplined, faith-driven, the real deal, projected an image of control and solidity. He was the responsible one. He was the one who trained harder, lived cleaner, carried himself with more dignity. When Holyfield went broke, people were shocked in a different way. The lesson in that contrast is about the gap between image and infrastructure. You can project discipline and still have chaotic finances. You can be genuinely faithful and hardworking and still make catastrophic financial decisions. The qualities that make a great athlete: the focus, the belief in oneself, the refusal to accept limits, are not the same qualities that make a great financial steward. Holyfield's tragedy is partly that nobody around him was able to translate the lessons of the gym into the language of the balance sheet. There is another dimension of the financial story that rarely gets discussed, but that sits underneath every other element. It is the tax dimension. Not just the income taxes on the fight purses, but the back taxes, the obligations to the IRS that accumulate when a high earner is not maintaining rigorous compliance with their tax responsibilities, when payments are delayed, when filings are incomplete, when the complexity of a financial empire exceeds the capacity of whoever is managing it. His financial troubles stemmed from a combination of poor investments, lifestyle expenses, and legal issues, including unpaid child support and back taxes. Back taxes are particularly dangerous because they compound. A tax liability that is manageable in year 1 becomes something dramatically different by year 3 or year 5. And for a man whose income was declining while his obligations were stable or increasing, the addition of compounding tax liability to an already stressed financial situation was a multiplier on every other problem he was facing. The full scope of what Holyfield owed when he filed for bankruptcy in 2012 has never been entirely made public. The $10 million in debts acknowledged in the bankruptcy filing was the number that made the headlines, but there are reasons to believe the full picture was more complicated. Obligations that were settled privately, assets that were disposed of in ways that did not require public disclosure, arrangements made with creditors that never made it into the court documents. What is clear is that the filing itself and the proceedings that followed represented a formal acknowledgement that the financial empire built on $230 million in career earnings had collapsed. The broader community's reaction to the mansion foreclosure and bankruptcy was layered. On one level, there was sympathy. Genuine, widely expressed sympathy for a man who had given everything to his sport and who had been failed by the systems that should have protected him. On another level, there was the kind of perverse fascination that attends any dramatic fall from a great height, the impulse that drives people to watch documentaries and click on videos and read articles about celebrities who lose everything, not out of malice, but out of a complex mixture of schadenfreude and cautionary tale hunger. On Reddit, in the boxing forums and the personal finance communities, the Holyfield financial story became a recurring reference point. A data point in arguments about athlete financial literacy, about the specific vulnerabilities of boxing as a profession, about what financial education should look like for young people entering high-earning careers. The threads would typically start with the mansion, the 109 rooms, the bowling alley, the $1 million annual upkeep, because that image crystallizes the abstract concept of spending beyond your means into something concrete and comprehensible. The sympathy was real, but so was the analysis. And the analysis, when it was conducted honestly, tended to arrive at a conclusion that was simultaneously charitable and hard. Holyfield was not a bad man. He was not reckless in the way that Tyson was reckless. He was not dissolute or self-destructive in the ways that have undone many athletes. He was, at the core, a generous and faithful man who believed in the people around him, who built his wealth as fast as he could, and who did not have the financial architecture in place to protect what he had built when the circumstances changed. The mansion was the most visible symptom of that failure of architecture. But the disease was systemic. One of the most revealing things about the mansion story is what Holyfield himself said about it years later. In interviews conducted well after the foreclosure, after the bankruptcy, after the full scale of what had happened had become undeniable, he spoke about the house with a combination of loss and clarity. He acknowledged that it had become a burden. He acknowledged that the advice to sell it, advice he had rejected, firing the accountant who gave it, had been correct. He acknowledged that his attachment to the property had been emotional rather than financial, that it had represented something he was not willing to let go of even when the letting go was clearly necessary. That acknowledgement takes courage. It requires a specific kind of character to look back at your own decisions, understand where they went wrong, and say so clearly without making excuses. Holyfield has done this, and it is one of the reasons his public image, even now, even with all of the financial wreckage behind him, remains largely sympathetic. People forgive mistakes that are acknowledged. People respect men who can stand in the debris of their own choices and describe them honestly. The mansion was gone. The Olympic medal was gone. The cars were gone. The businesses were gone. And in 2014, after a career that had spanned 30 years and 3 decades of championship-level competition, Holyfield retired from professional boxing, announcing his final retirement in June 2014. After not having fought in over 3 years, the fighting was over. Now the question was, what came next? What came next was the beginning of a reckoning, not a dramatic, cinematic moment of clarity, but a gradual and sometimes painful process of rebuilding. The bankruptcy filing was a wake-up call, prompting Holyfield to take more deliberate control of his financial situation. Over the years, he worked on rebuilding his wealth through strategic investments and business ventures. The word strategic here is doing significant work. These were not the grandiose ventures of the Holyfield who built a recording label and a Christian television network. On the back of $35 million fight purses, these were more modest efforts, calibrated to the reality of a man whose earning capacity had permanently contracted. His strategies included celebrity appearances at sporting events, fan expos, and media circuits, reality TV appearances on shows like Dancing with the Stars and Celebrity Big Brother UK, occasional partnerships with fitness brands or sports nutrition companies for modest endorsement deals, and charity work through the Holyfield Foundation, which remains active in youth programs. The scale of these activities is a fraction of what he was earning in his prime. A celebrity appearance fee, however generous, is not a $35 million fight purse. A fitness brand endorsement does not cover the running costs of a 54,000 square foot estate, but it is something. It is income. It is the maintenance of a public profile that allows for future opportunities. It is the work of a man who has not given up, who has adapted his methods to his circumstances, without abandoning the fundamental quality that defined him throughout his career. He is still in the game. The rules of the game have changed, and the stakes are different, but Evander Holyfield, the man, not the champion, is still competing. The community of boxing, fighters, trainers, promoters, analysts, has largely received Holyfield's post-career financial story with a kind of protective sadness. These are people who understand, from the inside, how the sport works. They know how promoters structure their cuts. They know how managers negotiate contracts that prioritize their own percentages. They know how fight purses are taxed and split and divided before the fighter ever sees a dollar. And they know that the fighter, in most cases, is the last person in the chain to be fully informed about what is happening to his own money. The financial structures of boxing, unlike most other major sports, do not include union representation, collective bargaining agreements, minimum salary floors, or mandatory financial education requirements. A young boxer can go from fighting for $500 in a regional club show to fighting for $5 million in a Vegas arena in the space of a few years, with nobody required to help him build the financial literacy to manage that transition. The sport generates enormous wealth for promoters, broadcasters, venues, and pay-per-view platforms. The distribution of that wealth to the fighters who create it has historically been less reliable. Holyfield's story sits within that systemic context. His individual choices, the mansion, the businesses, the extended career, were made within a system that did not prioritize his long-term financial well-being. The advisors who might have protected him had incentives that did not always align with his own. The sport that made him rich did not have institutional mechanisms to help him stay that way. Understanding the story as purely about individual failure misses this structural dimension. And missing it means missing the lessons that the story should teach. The legacy of the mansion and its foreclosure extends beyond Holyfield himself. It has become, in the years since, one of the most cited examples in discussions of athlete financial literacy. Financial advisors reference it in conversations with young athletes. Coaches mention it to prospects who are starting to see serious money for the first time. It has become shorthand for a specific kind of catastrophic financial misstep: the trophy that costs more than it is worth. The Holyfield Mansion story has also entered popular culture in ways that keep it in circulation long after the events themselves. The Rick Ross connection. A rapper known for luxurious imagery, purchasing the former home of a legendary boxer, generated its own layer of content, its own online discourse, its own videos and articles that sent new audiences back to the original story. Every time someone watched a tour of the property in its Rick Ross era, they inevitably asked the question about what happened to the man whose name is still on the road sign outside. And every time someone asks that question, the story of Evander Holyfield, the arc from Bowen Homes to Evander Holyfield Highway and back down again, gets told again. It gets told not just as a cautionary tale, though it is certainly that. It gets told as a human story, complicated, sympathetic, instructive, and ultimately about things that have nothing to do with boxing. Things like trust and ambition and the psychology of success, and the very human tendency to believe that what has come before will always continue to come. There is one more element of the Mansion story that has not been fully accounted for, and it sits in the gap between the public narrative and what Holyfield himself has maintained. The claim, expressed in his own words in various interviews, that family betrayal played a role in the financial collapse. The allegation that a second mortgage was taken out on the property without his knowledge or consent, that someone close to him used their access to extract value from his most significant asset, in a way that accelerated the timeline to foreclosure. If that allegation is accurate, it transforms part of the story from a narrative of financial mismanagement into a narrative of financial crime. It means that at least some of what happened to Evander Holyfield was not the result of his own choices, but of choices made by someone he trusted, with his assets, without his authorization. And it means that the full accounting of who is responsible for the financial collapse is more complicated than the public narrative, which tends to focus on Holyfield himself, allows. The reluctance to pursue this allegation publicly, to name the person involved, to make it the centerpiece of the explanation, is itself revealing. It speaks to a code that Holyfield has always operated by, a code of loyalty and faith that extends even to people who have arguably violated that code themselves. Whether that is admirable or simply costly, it is deeply characteristic of the man. He absorbed the betrayal, as he absorbed punches, and he kept moving forward. The story of the mansion eventually becomes the story of what comes after it. Because Evander Holyfield did not disappear when the house was foreclosed. He did not retreat from public life in shame. He did not become bitter or broken in the way that the circumstances might have warranted. Instead, he continued quietly, modestly, without the grand stage that had once been his constant backdrop, to live his life according to the principles that had always governed it. Holyfield remains involved in boxing events and media appearances, maintaining his status as a respected elder statesman of the sport. The elder statesman role is not glamorous. It does not come with the kind of purses that once made him one of the highest-paid athletes in the world, but it keeps him connected to the sport, keeps him present in the conversation, keeps his name and his story alive in ways that matter to him. And there is the mentorship work. Outside boxing, Holyfield has contributed to his community through charity work and mentorship. He's involved with youth programs in Atlanta and speaks at schools about perseverance and making smart choices. His willingness to discuss his mistakes publicly has helped other athletes avoid similar pitfalls. This is the Holyfield who speaks in schools, who tells young people honestly about what the money looked like and where it went, who uses his own story as instructional material. That version of Evander Holyfield, the one who walks into a school gymnasium and tells the truth about the mansion and the bankruptcy, and the things he wishes he had done differently, is perhaps the most valuable public version of him that has ever existed. The Holyfield Foundation represents the most sustained expression of his post-career identity. Through the foundation, he has remained connected to the communities that produced him. The Atlanta communities where young people are growing up in circumstances not entirely unlike the ones he grew up in places not entirely unlike Bowen Homes. The work is not making headlines. It is not generating the kind of social media content that drives views and clicks. It is simply people doing the unglamorous work of mentorship and community investment, one conversation at a time. This quieter mode of existence is a significant departure from the life Holyfield lived during his championship years, when every fight was a global event and his name was attached to everything from Coca-Cola commercials to video games. By 1992, Holyfield was already a household name, endorsing multiple products on television, such as Coca-Cola and Diet Coke. He also had a video game released for the Genesis and Game Gear, Evander Holyfield's Real Deal Boxing. That level of commercial ubiquity is simply not available to a man at his current stage of life and career. But the quiet is not the same thing as defeat. The man who grew up in Bowen Homes, who won a bronze medal at the 1984 Olympics, who beat Mike Tyson twice, who built a 54,000-square-foot mansion and lost it to foreclosure, who filed for bankruptcy and rebuilt to a modest stability. That man is not defeated. He is, in the truest sense of the word, that his nickname promised, the real deal. What the public reaction to Holyfield's financial story reveals about us, as an audience, is worth examining. The volumes of content, the YouTube documentaries, the Reddit threads, the Quora answers, the Twitter mentions that his story generates are not driven purely by schadenfreude or celebrity fascination. Recognition of vulnerabilities that are not unique to elite athletes, but are simply more visible, more dramatic, and more thoroughly documented in the case of people like Evander Holyfield. The lesson that people take from the story, the one that appears most consistently in the online discussions, the financial literacy classes, the boxing documentaries, about the gulf between income and wealth, about the way that financial decisions made during peak earning years compound for better or worse through the decades that follow. His experience demonstrates that making money is only half the battle. Keeping it requires different skills entirely. Those different skills, the skills of wealth preservation, of financial planning, of recognizing and managing risk, are skills that should have been available to Evander Holyfield and were not. At least not in the forms and with the consistency that might have made a difference. That is not entirely his failure. It is partly a failure of the systems around him, and understanding it as such is essential to drawing the right lessons from it. The city of Atlanta, for its part, has never stopped honoring Evander Holyfield. The road sign is still there. In 2017, a statue of Evander Holyfield, designed by sculptor Brian Hanlon, was commissioned by the city of Atlanta for installation in downtown Atlanta. A statue in the heart of a city that produced him, that celebrated him, that named a road after him, and then watched his financial empire collapse along that road. The statue stands not as a monument to his wealth, but as a monument to his achievement. The achievement of becoming the greatest heavyweight of his generation, of winning titles nobody thought he could win, of getting up every time the sport knocked him down. Mayor Kasim Reed, at the unveiling, said, "Holyfield is an Olympic bronze medalist, the four-time heavyweight champion of the world, and now a Hall of Famer. He represents what is possible in Atlanta. Coming from humble beginnings through dedication, hard work, and a supportive community, rising as a champion." That description, coming from humble beginnings, rising as a champion, is accurate and complete as far as it goes. But it is only the first half of the story. The second half, the part about what happened after the rising, is equally important and equally instructive. The statue and the road sign coexist with the bankruptcy filing and the foreclosure proceedings, and together they tell the full story. Not the sanitized version, not the inspirational poster version, but the human one, complicated, imperfect, illuminating. The real deal in the most complete sense of that phrase. As of 2026, Evander Holyfield's story is not over. The financial chapter, the chapter of the mansion and the bankruptcy and the sold Olympic medal, is behind him. As of 2026, Evander Holyfield's net worth is estimated to be $1 million. His financial difficulties led to the foreclosure of his $10 million Atlanta estate in 2008, which was later acquired by rapper Rick Ross, $1 million. From a peak of over $100 million, The distance between those two numbers is the distance between the man he was at the height of his power and the man he is today. But it is not the measure of his worth as a person or as a competitor, or as a figure whose story has something real and lasting to teach. What happened to the mansion on Evander Holyfield Highway is, in the end, a story about the dangers of confusing symbols with substance. The house was a symbol. The money it consumed was substance. When the substance ran out in the service of the symbol was lost. Auctioned at the courthouse steps, purchased by a rapper, repurposed as someone else's trophy. But the man whose name is on the road sign? He's still there, still standing, still the real deal, just in a form that looks nothing like the one the world first fell in love with, and everything like the one that was always underneath it. To understand how Evander Holyfield got to the point where a courtroom was threatening him with imprisonment over child support payments, you have to go back to the fights. Not just the ones in the ring, though those matter enormously, but the fights outside it. The fights with promoters, with the Nevada State Athletic Commission, with the medical establishment, with the passage of time itself. Because the story of what really happened to Evander Holyfield is, at its core, a story about what happens when a man refuses to stop fighting. Long past the point when fighting is wise, the heart condition episode of 1994, which we covered in part 1, established the template. A setback arrives. The establishment says stop. Holyfield refuses. He finds a way through, and the way through leads to some of the greatest victories of his career. The lesson his own biography taught him over and over again was that refusing to accept limits worked, that faith and willpower could bend reality, that the people telling him it was over were wrong. And so when the financial crisis arrived in the late 2000s, and when his physical ability to compete was clearly diminishing, and when every honest advisor was telling him to stop, the template was already written. He fought through that too, but the fights that shaped his bank account most directly were the fights inside the ring. And to understand those fights, we need to revisit them not just as sporting events but as financial transactions, as negotiations between Holyfield and his earning potential, between his physical capabilities and the marketplace that had been built around them. The Riddick-Bowe trilogy is a chapter of boxing history that tends to get overshadowed by the Tyson fights, but it arguably defined Holyfield's career arc more completely. Bowe was a different kind of problem than Tyson, bigger, heavier, more technically complete, with the size advantage that Holyfield had always overcome through will and conditioning. Their first fight, in November 1992, was voted Fight of the Year by virtually every boxing publication, a 12-round war that went to Bowe by unanimous decision. That first Bowe loss was Holyfield's first professional defeat, the first time in a career that had begun with an Olympic bronze medal and proceeded through championship after championship, that the answer at the final bell was no. He had been knocked down twice. He had been hurt in ways that earlier opponents had not managed to hurt him, and the belt, the undisputed heavyweight championship, had changed hands. What Holyfield did with that defeat is instructive. He came back. He demanded the rematch. He trained with a ferocity that people in his camp described as frightening, as though the first loss had recalibrated something fundamental in him, had reminded him what was at stake. The rematch produced one of the most chaotic and memorable moments in boxing history. In the 7th round, a parachutist descended into the ring from the open roof of the Caesars Palace outdoor arena, interrupting the fight, creating pandemonium, and changing the rhythm and momentum of a bout. That Holyfield would go on to win on a majority decision to reclaim the championship. You genuinely cannot make this sport up. The third Bowe fight, in November 1995, went to Bowe again, a TKO stoppage in the 8th round. By this point, the trilogy had established something important about Holyfield. He was a man capable of taking enormous punishment and continuing to compete. His chin was durable, his will was indomitable, and his conditioning was exceptional, even by the standards of elite professional boxing. But the trilogy also took something from him that cannot be fully quantified: the accumulated physiological cost of 3 brutal fights against a man who was physically bigger and heavier than him, who had the power to move him and hurt him in ways that lesser opponents could not. This physical cost matters to the financial story because it is inseparable from it. Every round absorbed in those Bowe fights, every punch taken, Every exchange in the trenches was deposited into a ledger of accumulated damage that would eventually need to be paid. The body keeps a more thorough accounting than any financial advisor, and the payments, when they came due later in Holyfield's career, came in the form of diminished reflexes, slower recovery, reduced capacity to sustain the output that had once made him the most complete heavyweight in the world. The Lennox Lewis fights in 1999 added to that ledger. In 1999, Holyfield received $15 million in his loss to Lennox Lewis. The first fight, contested in Madison Square Garden, was a draw that most observers and most neutral analysts scored clearly for Lewis. The draw allowed both camps to claim enough of the narrative to demand a rematch. The rematch, later in 1999, went to Lewis by unanimous decision. Holyfield had been beaten clearly by the best heavyweight of the era, and the signs of physical decline were unmistakable to anyone watching. The New York State Athletic Commission's 2005 decision to ban Holyfield from boxing in New York deserves examination in full. In August 2005, it had been reported that the New York State Athletic Commission had banned Evander Holyfield from boxing in New York due to diminishing skills, despite the fact that Holyfield had passed a battery of medical tests. The phrase diminishing skills is a clinical way of describing something that is devastating when applied to a man whose entire identity, personal, professional, financial, is built around his ability to compete. The commission was not saying he was injured. It was not saying the tests had found something wrong. It was saying that the observable quality of his performance had declined to the point where it was no longer safe to allow him to fight in New York. Holyfield contested this characterization vigorously. He was adamant that his losses were the result of a shoulder injury, not of old age. This is a statement that is simultaneously plausible and insufficient. Yes, a shoulder injury can affect a boxer's performance significantly, but it does not explain the full picture. The slower hands, the reduced ability to cut off the ring, the diminished capacity to sustain the quality of effort that had defined his peak years. Something beyond the shoulder was happening to Evander Holyfield, and the people responsible for protecting the sport could see it even if he could not or would not. The ban from New York was not the end of his fighting career. The 2008 Value AV fight, the 2021 Belfort fight, and others happened after it. But it was a significant marker, a moment when an official body of sports governance essentially said, this man should not be fighting anymore for his own protection. And Holyfield, as he had done with every other form of authority that had tried to stop him, found ways around it. The steroid allegations that surfaced in 2007 added another dimension to an already complicated story. On February 28, 2007, Holyfield was anonymously linked to Applied Pharmacy Services, a pharmacy in Alabama that was under investigation for supplying athletes with illegal steroids and human growth hormone. The connection was circumstantial but specific. A patient by the name of Evan Fields caught investigators' attention. Fields shared the same birth date as Holyfield, October 19, 1962. The listed address for Fields was 794 Evander, Fairfield, Georgia. Holyfield had a very similar address. When the phone number associated with the Fields prescription was dialed, Holyfield answered. The circumstantial case was considerable. Same birthday, near identical address. A name that is essentially an anagram of Evander Holyfield. A phone number that connected directly to the man himself. And yet Holyfield maintained, consistently and vehemently, that he had never used performance-enhancing drugs. Dr. Margaret Goodman, the chairman of the Nevada Athletic Commission's Medical Advisory Board, clarified that Holyfield has never failed a steroid test. Never failed a test in a career during which he was, as he himself claimed, one of the most tested athletes in sports. The allegations were never conclusively proven. The name Evan Fields was never officially connected to Holyfield through legal proceedings. But the episode, the anonymous tip, the phone answered by Holyfield, the birth date match, the address, cast a shadow over the final years of his career, adding a layer of controversy to a story that was already abundantly complex. What the fights and the controversies around them reveal, taken together, is a picture of a man in an impossible position. He had built a financial life that required a certain level of income to sustain. That income came from fighting. Fighting required his ongoing physical presence in the ring, at a level of competition that was becoming harder to achieve as his body aged and his accumulated damage mounted. And so he kept fighting. Not always wisely. Not always at the level that his legacy deserved, but with the only tool he had always had, an absolute refusal to stop. After the Nielsen fight, Holyfield attempted to land a shot at a world heavyweight title, all major belts being held by Wladimir and Vitaly Klitschko. However, after more than a year of trying to land this fight, Yahoo News reported his intention to retire in 2012, with Holyfield stating, "The game's been good to me, and I hope I've been good to the game." The Klitschko fights never happened. The champions had no incentive to give Holyfield a title shot. He was past his peak, and a win over him would not have carried the symbolic weight it once would have. The world had moved on, even if Holyfield hadn't. The gap between the fighter Holyfield was, and the fighter the sport needed him to be, for commercial purposes had opened into an unbridgeable gulf. In his prime, he was the fight everyone wanted to see. By the early 2010s, he was a legacy name, still meaningful, still capable of generating a certain level of interest, but not the drawing card that could command the purses he needed. The mathematics were inexorable, and they pointed in one direction. The 2021 Belfort fight represents the endpoint of this arc, and it is painful in a way that transcends sport. Evander Holyfield returned in 2021 for an exhibition match against former MMA fighter Vitor Belfort, earning $500,000. He lost in the first round by technical knockout, and he likely took the fight solely due to his financial issues at the time. 58 years old, against a man 14 years younger, a professional martial artist who had trained seriously for the contest. The fight lasted less than a full round. Holyfield was stopped. His corner stepped in, and the images from that night, the most recent set of images most people have of Evander Holyfield in competition, were not the images of the champion who stopped Mike Tyson in 11 rounds, or who stood with blood on his face and kept throwing punches at Riddick Bowe. They were the images of an old man who had been persuaded by necessity or by pride or by some combination of both to step back into a ring he had no business being in. At 58, Belfort was 14 years younger than Holyfield and looked to be in much better shape than the former champ. Fans were concerned for Evander Holyfield, who seemed to struggle even on the promotional advertisements during the open workouts. When fans are worried about a fighter during the open workouts, not the fight, the workouts, the situation has moved beyond sport and into something else entirely. Something that combines concern and culpability and the unavoidable question, who let this happen? The answer to that question is not simple, and it is not fair to assign it entirely to any single party. The promoters who put together the Belfort fight made a calculation that the commercial appeal of Holyfield's name outweighed the physical risks to a 58-year-old man. The athletic commission in the state where the fight was held licensed it. The team around Holyfield, whoever was in his corner at that point, allowed him to take it. And Holyfield himself, exercising the same iron will that had defined every decision of his career, chose to fight. But there is something deeply uncomfortable about a system in which a 58-year-old former champion, a man whose financial situation had left him with $1 million from a $230 million career, is the one absorbing the risk of a sporting contest, while the people arranging it pocket fees that are not contingent on taking any punches. The sport of boxing has always had this quality. The fighter takes the irreversible physical risks, while the financial risks are distributed across a much wider group of stakeholders. What makes the Belfort fight particularly stark is the degree to which the financial desperation behind the decision was visible to everyone watching. There is a conversation happening in boxing and in combat sports more broadly about what responsibility promoters, regulators, and institutions have to protect fighters from the financial circumstances that drive decisions like the Belfort fight. That conversation is ongoing and unresolved. Holyfield's story is one of its most powerful catalysts. The fights also shape the family story in ways that are not always obvious, but that are deeply connected to the financial one, because the lifestyle that the fights funded, the mansion, the businesses, the entourage, also funded the relationships that created the family obligations. And the family obligations, in turn, created the financial pressures that drove him back to the ring long past the point of wisdom. 3 divorce settlements quickly slashed his net worth in half, along with child support payments to 11 children by 6 different women, 3 marriages, 11 children, 6 mothers. Each relationship, each dissolution, each child support agreement was its own financial universe, managing the intersection of those universes while also managing a boxing career, a business empire, a mansion, and a personal life built around faith and family, was an exercise in complexity that would have challenged the most sophisticated financial operation. Holyfield was not a sophisticated financial operation. He was a boxer, an extraordinary boxer, one of the greatest who ever lived, but a boxer whose financial education had been conducted almost entirely in real time, through experience rather than preparation, with advisors whose interests did not always align with his own. The child who grew up in Bowen homes had made it out. He had done it through an act of will so sustained and so extraordinary that it stands as one of the great individual athletic achievements of the 20th century. But making it out of poverty does not automatically install the financial literacy to sustain what making it out produces. These are different skills built in different environments, requiring different kinds of knowledge and different kinds of support. Mayor Reed, speaking about Holyfield's legacy, said, "He represents what is possible in Atlanta, coming from humble beginnings, through dedication, hard work, and a supportive community, rising as a champion." That is absolutely true, and what his story also represents, with equal force and equally useful lessons, is what is possible when those same qualities, deployed without adequate financial infrastructure, collide with the economic realities of life after peak earning. The rise is one story, the descent is another. Both are real. Both matter. Both have things to teach. The battles that defined and drained Evander Holyfield, in the ring and out of it, with opponents and with courts and with his own body and the people around him, were not simply the product of bad luck or bad character. They were the product of a set of systems. The boxing industry, the financial advisory world, the legal structures around athlete earnings and family obligations that were not designed to produce the outcome that his talent and his effort deserved. That is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. And it sits there regardless of how the other elements of the narrative are evaluated. The physical toll of the career also manifests in ways that go beyond the obvious. People who encounter Holyfield in interviews and public appearances in recent years have noted changes in his speech patterns, a slowing, a deliberateness, a quality that is consistent with the cumulative neurological effects of 30 years of professional boxing. He has never been formally diagnosed with chronic traumatic encephalopathy or any other specific neurological condition. But the physical evidence of his career is present in the way he carries himself and the way he speaks in ways that cannot be entirely attributed to age alone. This dimension of the story, the long-term neurological cost of boxing at the elite level, is one that the sport has been deeply reluctant to confront directly. Boxing's governing bodies, its promoters, its television partners, and much of its fan base have a vested interest in not examining too closely what 30 years of punches absorbed by the best heavyweights in the world actually does to a man's brain. The NFL's reckoning with chronic traumatic encephalopathy and the football-related brain injuries of former players, boxing's equivalent reckoning has been slower and less complete. Holyfield's story sits within that broader conversation, whether he himself has chosen to position it there or not. The man who fought through a heart condition, who came back from what was told to him was career-ending, who fought at 58 years old for financial reasons. That man's physical legacy is inseparable from the physical cost of the choices that made him great. The story of the Tyson fights, revisited in this context, takes on additional layers. At the time, those 2 fights represented the apex, the most dramatic and financially rewarding moments of an extraordinary career. But they also represented something else. They represented the moment when Holyfield's financial lifestyle fully committed itself to a scale that his future earning capacity could not sustain. The $47 million from those two fights was the jet fuel that powered the mansion, the businesses, the entourage, and the family obligations at the scale they operated. When the fuel ran out, the infrastructure it had powered did not scale back proportionately. The bite fight in particular has an almost mythological status in sports history. His most famous fights include two victories over Mike Tyson in the mid-1990s, particularly their 1997 rematch that ended when Tyson bit off a piece of Holyfield's ear. In one of boxing's most infamous moments, the ear, the bite, the moment that transcended sport and became genuine cultural history, the event that people who have never watched a boxing match in their lives know about and can describe. Holyfield's ear was reattached. His bank account was not. The irony, and it is a substantial irony, is that the most famous moment of his career, the moment that is most likely to be remembered and discussed 100 years from now, was a moment of violation inflicted upon him. He did not bite anyone. He did not create the incident. He was the victim of it. And yet it is his name, not Tyson's, that is most associated with the event. Holyfield's ear in perpetuity, for better and for worse. There is a generational dimension to Holyfield's story that has not been fully explored in the public narrative. His son, Evander Holyfield, known in boxing circles as Young Holy, has pursued a professional boxing career of his own, and Evan's story has already produced an echo of his father's most dramatic medical crisis. Reports emerged about Evander Holyfield requiring open-heart surgery, with his mother subsequently opening up about him getting back into the gym. A son who, like his father, faced a serious cardiac condition, and a question about whether his career could or should continue. A son who, like his father, fought through it. The parallel is remarkable and bittersweet. The qualities that Evander Holyfield modeled, the willingness to push through medical obstacles, the refusal to accept the limits that the body and the institution seemed to set, were clearly transmitted to his child. The same qualities that enabled Evander's extraordinary career, and that contributed to the circumstances that endangered his health, are now manifesting in the next generation. This generational dimension is not a simple moral lesson. It does not reduce to Evander should have stopped fighting sooner, so his son would learn differently. Life is not that tidy. It is rather an observation about the transmission of values, about how the lessons we live, the choices we make visible to our children, become the framework within which they construct their own choices. Evander's resilience is his legacy in the most literal possible sense. The people who came out better from their professional relationship with Holyfield deserve mention here, because they are part of the story too. The promoters who structured the purses for the Tyson fights, the Bowe fights, the Lewis fights, they took significant percentages of enormous sums and retained those percentages without being subject to the same financial pressures that eventually caught up with Holyfield himself. The advisors who extracted management fees from his earnings over 30 years. The attorneys who billed hundreds of thousands for the child support proceedings, and the divorce settlements and the bankruptcy filings. The boxing ecosystem that surrounds the fighter is, by design, structured in a way that protects everyone except the fighter from the consequences of the fighter's declining earnings. Promoters take their cut when the fighter is at his peak and move on to the next prospect when the peak passes. Managers negotiate contracts that pay well during the high-earning years and do not typically include provisions for long-term financial stewardship after the career ends. The institutional support that major team sports provide through unions, collective bargaining, and mandatory financial programs simply does not exist in boxing. Holyfield's story is not unique in this regard. It is an extreme and particularly well-documented version of a story that has played out across boxing's history, from Joe Louis to Muhammad Ali, to Mike Tyson, to Oscar de la Hoya. The greatest fighters of every era have been vulnerable to the same pattern of financial exploitation, not always intentional, often simply structural, that characterizes the sport. What makes Holyfield's version particularly resonant is the contrast between the scale of his earnings and the scale of what remains. The fights with Don King's promotional machinery deserve their own examination. King, the most powerful boxing promoter of the 1980s and 1990s, had a complicated relationship with virtually every major fighter of that era. including both Holyfield and Tyson. His promotional arrangements were often structured in ways that maximized King's own cut of the money, and fighters who believed they had been underpaid relative to their drawing power frequently found themselves in legal disputes with his organization. Holyfield, like many fighters, had litigation with the promotional apparatus of his era, the promotional splits for major fights, the back-end arrangements around pay-per-view revenue, the management structures that governed access to the most lucrative matchups. All of these were negotiated in environments where Holyfield's side of the table had less information, less leverage, and less structural protection than the promotional side. In a sport where information asymmetry is built into the commercial structure, the fighter is almost always at a disadvantage. This structural vulnerability is not the same thing as being stolen from, though in some cases it may cross that line. It is, more precisely, the result of a system that does not require transparent disclosure of financial arrangements to the people whose labor generates the underlying value. Holyfield earned $230 million in career purses, but the gross revenue generated by his fights, the pay-per-view buys, the gate receipts, the broadcast fees, the merchandise, was a multiple of that figure. The difference between what he received and what was generated by his performances represents the structural toll that the boxing industry extracts from its labor. The conversation about what Holyfield could have done differently is a necessary one, even if it is uncomfortable, because while the structural factors are real and significant, so are the individual choices. The mansion was a choice. The businesses were choices. The extended career was a choice. The firing of advisors who gave difficult advice was a choice. Taken together, these choices created conditions in which no structural protection could have saved him from everything that followed. The most honest accounting of Holyfield's financial story involves both the structural and the personal, both the systems that failed him and the decisions he made, that a different framework might have prevented. From earning over $230 million to filing bankruptcy, then rebuilding a modest fortune. His financial journey covers the full spectrum of possibilities, the full spectrum. The highest highs and the lowest lows, separated by a span of years that went by faster than anyone expected. What would different decisions have produced? What if the accountant who said to sell the mansion had been heard? What if the advisors who said to stop fighting had been heeded? What if the financial literacy that now seems obvious in retrospect had been available and actionable when the decisions were being made? We can only speculate, but the speculation has value because it points toward the interventions that might help the next generation of athletes avoid repeating the pattern. The 2012 bankruptcy filing was the formal endpoint of the financial crisis, but it was not the emotional endpoint. The emotional endpoint came over a series of years, as Holyfield slowly recalibrated, as he came to terms with a life that looked nothing like the life he had expected to be living at this stage, and found within that recalibrated life things that had perhaps been obscured by the scale of what came before. Faith was always central. The same faith that had convinced him a healer in Philadelphia could cure his heart. The same faith that had led him to pray before training sessions. The same faith that had seen him through the Tyson fights and the Bow Wars, and the long twilight of a career that refused to end. That faith did not abandon him when the mansion was foreclosed. If anything, the people who know him describe it as deepening, as becoming more the core of his identity, rather than one element among many. Faith as a financial strategy is not something that can be quantified, but as a psychological resource, as a framework for understanding loss, for finding meaning in difficulty, for maintaining the will to continue when the material conditions of life have collapsed. It appears to have been one of the things that kept Evander Holyfield intact through the worst years. Not intact financially, intact as a person. The emotional weight of what Holyfield has been through is staggering when you sit with it. The boy from Bowen Homes who dreamed about being somebody. The young man who won a bronze medal at the Olympics, in a fight most people thought he should have won for gold. The champion who beat Mike Tyson when everyone said it was impossible. The man who came back from a career-ending heart diagnosis through faith and willpower. The athlete who earned $230 million with his hands and his heart and his will, and watched almost all of it disappear. The father of 11 children managing obligations across multiple households. while his own financial life was disintegrating. Any single one of those storylines would be enough to constitute a life. Together, they form something that is almost too dense with experience to fully comprehend. And the fact that the man who has lived that accumulation of storylines is still here, still present, still talking about what he has learned, still mentoring young fighters, and speaking to young people in Atlanta schools, that fact deserves to be acknowledged. He could have disappeared. He could have retreated into bitterness or shame or denial. Many people in his position have done exactly that. Instead, Evander Holyfield has remained present and visible, and honest about what happened to him and why. That is its own form of courage, greater than anything that happened in the ring. But perhaps more difficult, the boxing community's reaction to Holyfield's story has evolved over time. In the immediate aftermath of the foreclosure and bankruptcy, there was shock and a degree of judgment, the instinctive response to seeing someone who appeared to have everything. Allow it to slip through their fingers, but as the years have passed and the full picture has become clearer, the dominant sentiment within the sport has shifted towards something more sympathetic and more analytical. Fighters who came up in the same era as Holyfield, who competed against him or alongside him, have spoken about his story with a kind of protective acknowledgement, an understanding that what happened to him could happen to anyone in the sport, that the financial vulnerabilities he encountered are structural rather than individual, that the criticism should be directed at least as much at the system as at the man. The broader public, the YouTube audience, the Reddit community, the Quora respondents, has largely followed the same trajectory. Initial fascination with the scale of the collapse has given way to a more nuanced appreciation of the factors involved. People who come to the story expecting a simple morality tale about excess and irresponsibility tend to leave it with something more complicated and more useful, an understanding of the ways that financial systems fail athletes, of the structural vulnerabilities of a sport that monetizes men's bodies without adequately protecting their futures, the battles that defined and drained Evander Holyfield in the ring and in the courts, with opponents and with institutions and with the passage of time, are all part of a single, continuous story, a story that begins in Bowen Homes, moves through every boxing gym and arena the sport has to offer, passes through a 109-room mansion and a courthouse and a bankruptcy filing and a 58-year-old man getting stopped in the first round, and arrives in the present, in a modest life in Atlanta, a net worth of $1 million, and a legacy that is held by a man who is still here to speak for himself. Holyfield's experience highlights a common theme in sports, but it also underscores the possibility of financial recovery. Financial recovery, not financial restoration, not the return of the $230 million, or the 234-acre estate, or the 135-seat movie theater, but recovery in the sense of stability, of forward motion, of a life that is livable and purposeful and honest about what it is. That is the Evander Holyfield who exists today. Not the champion with every belt and every purse and every trophy the sport has to offer, but a real deal in a different sense, authentic, present, accountable, and still fighting, just in the way that matters most. There is a question that never quite gets asked in the Evander Holyfield story, even though it is the most important one. The question is not just, what happened to Evander Holyfield? The question is, why does this keep happening? Why is the story of the boxing champion who earns hundreds of millions and ends up with almost nothing not a rare and shocking exception to the rule, but rather a recurring pattern that has played out across virtually every generation of the sport's history? Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, the most dominant heavyweight champion of his era, a man who fought for his country, and who the American government later used as a propaganda symbol, died in poverty, pursued by the IRS for tax debts that compounded through decades of poor financial management and exploitative promotional arrangements. Muhammad Ali, for all his cultural power and commercial significance, was financially mismanaged in ways that left him far less wealthy than his earning potential should have produced. Mike Tyson earned an estimated $300 million and declared bankruptcy. Oscar de la Hoya built a promotional empire, but was himself the product of financial arrangements that took more than they left. The pattern is so consistent, so persistent, and so widely documented that the explanation cannot be individual. It cannot be that Joe Louis and Muhammad Ali and Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield, men separated by decades with entirely different personalities, entirely different support structures, all independently made the same category of mistakes. Something structural is happening, something about the sport itself, about the way it is organized and governed and financed, produces this outcome with enough regularity to constitute a systemic failure. The financial architecture of boxing is unlike that of any other major sport. In the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, and the NHL, players are represented by unions that negotiate collectively with team owners over minimum salaries, maximum contract terms, pension arrangements, and the distribution of league revenue. A player who enters those leagues enters into a system that has been designed, however imperfectly, to protect some minimum level of financial well-being. A boxer entering the professional ranks steps into a system with no union, no minimum salary, no collective bargaining, no mandatory pension, and no institutional financial education requirement. The fighter signs contracts individually, often without adequate legal representation, negotiated with promoters and managers who have done this thousands of times and who understand the leverage dynamics completely. The fighter has usually done it once. The promoter has done it their entire career. The information asymmetry in that negotiation is profound. Promoters take their cuts off the top. The manager typically takes between 20 and 33% of the fighter's purse. The promoter takes a promotional fee. The training team takes their percentages, the arena rent, the production costs, the sanctioning body fees. All of these come out before the fighter sees a dollar. By the time those deductions are made, and before federal and state taxes are applied, the fighter may be retaining as little as 50 cents of every dollar that is nominally his fight purse. Holyfield's estimated $230 million in prize money alone was the gross figure. The net, the money that actually reached his pocket, was considerably less. The tax dimension deserves its own examination because it is a multiplier on every other financial problem. A boxer at Holyfield's level, earning tens of millions per fight in the 1990s, was subject to federal marginal tax rates that, in that era, ran as high as 39.6%. Add state taxes in Nevada or New York or wherever the fight was held, and the effective tax rate on the largest purses could approach 50% of the gross figure. That is not unique to boxers. Every high earner faces these rates, but most high earners in other industries, corporate executives, investment bankers, successful entrepreneurs, retirement accounts, investment vehicles, trusts, business structures that allow for legitimate tax management, athletes in general, and boxers in particular, often do not receive the kind of sophisticated tax planning that would allow them to manage these obligations effectively. The back taxes that appeared in Holyfield's financial filings are the downstream consequence of inadequate tax planning during the years of peak earnings. His financial troubles stemmed from a combination of poor investments, lifestyle expenses, and legal issues, including unpaid child support and back taxes. The back taxes were not the result of deliberate evasion. They were the result of a financial operation that was not adequately managed, that did not have the sophistication in place to handle the volume and complexity of the obligations it was generating. The role of promoters in the financial stories of boxing champions deserves specific attention, and in Holyfield's case, that means looking at the promotional landscape of the 1990s. The era when Holyfield was at his peak was the era of Don King's dominance as a boxing promoter, an era characterized by promotional contracts that were deeply favorable to King's organization, by disputes over purse amounts, by fighters who believed they had been underpaid for their most lucrative bouts, and by legal battles that dragged on for years after the fights themselves had been forgotten. King's methods, the long-term exclusive promotional agreements, the arrangements that tied fighters to his organization while giving him extensive control over their opponents and their purse structures, were widely criticized by fighters, managers, and analysts throughout his reign. Multiple fighters sued him with varying degrees of success. The structural dynamic of his arrangements, promoter with extensive leverage versus fighter with limited alternatives, was not unique to King. but was particularly pronounced in his operation. Holyfield navigated this promotional landscape without always being on the most favorable terms. The structures that determined how much of the pay-per-view revenue from the Tyson fights ended up in his pocket, as opposed to in the promotional coffers, were negotiated in an environment where the fighter's side had less information and less leverage than the promotional side. The gross revenue of both Tyson fights was astronomical. The question of how much of that astronomical figure Holyfield retained in net terms is one that has never been fully and publicly answered. The pay-per-view model that made the Tyson fight so enormously valuable is itself a structure worth examining. When a fight generates millions of pay-per-view buys at a retail price of $40 or $50 or more, the gross revenue is staggering, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars for a single event. The distribution of that revenue among the fighters, the promoters, the broadcasters, the cable operators, and the various other parties in the chain is determined by contracts that are not public and by arrangements that are negotiated entirely outside the fighter's direct view. Holyfield's purses from the Tyson fights, the figures that have been reported publicly, represent what his contract guaranteed him. They do not necessarily represent his full participation in the revenue that his performance generated. Whether back-end arrangements, pay-per-view revenue shares, and other contingent payments were made according to whatever agreements were in place, and whether those agreements were structured in a way that accurately reflected his contribution to the event's commercial success, are questions that have not been fully answered publicly. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the mundane reality of how the boxing business works. Arrangements negotiated in private with unequal leverage, producing outcomes that are not always visible to the people who do the work that generates the underlying value. Understanding this dimension of the financial story is not about casting blame. It is about accurately describing the environment in which Holyfield's financial decisions were made, and the degree to which that environment was structured to extract value from him rather than to protect it for him. The management dimension of Holyfield's financial story is equally important and equally structural. Boxing managers are licensed and regulated, but the standards for financial management and transparency in the sport are not equivalent to those that govern, for example, registered investment advisors in the securities industry. A boxer's manager is not required to operate as a fiduciary, someone legally obligated to put the client's financial interests first. A manager who steers a fighter toward a particular fight because it is more profitable for the manager than for the fighter is not necessarily violating any rule. This structural misalignment of interests between the fighter's long-term financial well-being and the manager's short-term financial incentives is baked into the sport. It produces predictable outcomes. Fighters who are pushed back into the ring when they should retire, because a fight means a paycheck for the manager as well as the fighter. Fighters who are steered toward opponents who are commercially attractive rather than competitively appropriate. Fighters who are not adequately informed about the financial arrangements that govern their careers. The yes-men culture that Holyfield himself has acknowledged. The atmosphere in which people who challenged him were replaced by people who agreed with him, did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a financial ecosystem in which the people around him had more to gain from his continued activity than from his long-term well-being. The yes men were, in many cases, people whose income depended on Holyfield continuing to fight, continuing to spend, continuing to maintain a lifestyle that required an ongoing source of income. Their incentives did not align with his retirement. The child support system, as it intersected with Holyfield's story, is itself a structure that merits examination. And the spectacle of a man who earned $230 million being taken to court for unpaid child support is not one that admits of easy justification. But the structure of child support awards, the way they are set, the way they are maintained, the way they interact with the realities of fluctuating income from athletic careers, can itself create conditions that are difficult to navigate. Child support awards in cases involving high earners are often set based on income at the time of the award. When a high earner's income subsequently declines, as Holyfield's did, and as any athletes eventually must, the award remains at its original level unless modified by the court. The gap between the income available and the obligations set at peak earnings can become extreme. And navigating the legal process required to modify the award requires exactly the kind of legal and financial sophistication that people in financial distress often cannot afford. In mid-2012, the Georgia Department of Human Services claimed Evander owed $372,097.40 to his daughter Evander Holyfield and requested that a judge order Holyfield to be imprisoned. That is not the full picture of his child support obligations. It is one filing, one dispute, one amount owed to one child at one point in time, multiplied across 11 children and however many separate support agreements were in force simultaneously. The aggregate obligation was substantial, and it was an obligation set in a period of higher income, being met in a period of declining income, without adequate mechanisms in place to bridge the gap. The broader athletic financial literacy problem, of which Holyfield's story is one prominent example, has generated increasing attention in recent years. The NBA Players Association, the NFL Players Association, and other major sports unions have implemented financial education programs for their members, recognizing that the transition from high-earning athlete to civilian life is a financial cliff that requires preparation. These programs vary in quality and uptake, but their existence represents an acknowledgement that the financial vulnerabilities of elite athletes are predictable and preventable. Boxing has no equivalent institutional structure. There is no boxers' union. There is no mandatory financial education program for licensed professional boxers. There is no institutional mechanism by which a young boxer moving from regional shows to world title contention receives the financial preparation that would allow him or her to protect the wealth that success in the sport produces. This is a failure that sits at the institutional level, not with Holyfield, not with Tyson, not with Joe Louis, but with the sport and the regulatory bodies that govern it. The pattern of boxing champions going broke is so consistent, so well documented, and so widely known that the continued absence of mandatory financial education in the sport represents a choice, not an oversight. It is a choice that serves the interests of promoters and managers who benefit from the financial vulnerability of their fighters, and it is a choice that costs fighters like Evander Holyfield everything. The NFLPA's investigation into former players' financial situations, conducted in the early 2010s, found that a significant percentage of NFL retirees experienced serious financial distress within 2 years of leaving the league. The NBA Players Association found similar patterns among its retirees. These findings, and the programs they spawned, were driven by data, by the accumulation of individual stories like Holyfield's into a pattern that demanded systemic response. Boxing has not had that equivalent reckoning, at least not at an institutional level. Individual voices, retired fighters, boxing analysts, financial advisors who work with athletes, have raised these issues repeatedly, but without a collective structure, without an organization that represents all fighters, and has the standing to demand changes from promoters and regulatory bodies. Those voices do not translate into structural change. The result is a sport that continues to produce financial casualties at an extraordinary rate, and that continues to allow those casualties to be framed as individual failures, as the results of personal choices and personal shortcomings, rather than as the predictable outcomes of a system designed in a way that prioritizes everyone's financial interests over the fighters. The Mike Tyson comparison is, at this point in the story, almost inescapable. Both men earned hundreds of millions. Both declared bankruptcy. Both have found, in the years since the formal financial crisis, ways to rebuild. Tyson through his podcast, through acting work, through the commercial empire he has constructed around his own notoriety. Holyfield through appearances, through mentorship, through the quieter work of community engagement. The differences between their trajectories are instructive. Tyson's financial recovery has been more visible and more commercially successful, in part because Tyson's brand is built around a kind of gleeful transgression that translates into entertainment content. His podcast became enormously popular. His ear-shaped cannabis gummies, the ones shaped like Holyfield's ear, the missing piece from the bite fight, became a viral marketing moment. The chaos that drove his financial downfall also fuels the commercial persona that drives his financial recovery. Holyfield does not have that kind of commercially legible brand to rebuild around. His brand is built around faith and discipline and hard work, qualities that are genuinely admirable and deeply held, but that are less easily monetized in the current content economy than Tyson's mix of menace and self-deprecating humor. Holyfield remains involved in boxing events and media appearances, maintaining his status as a respected elder statesman of the sport. Elder statesman is a term that connotes respect, but not commercial dynamism. It describes a role that is valuable to the sport and to the people who care about it, but that does not generate the kind of income that would meaningfully alter the $1 million net worth figure. The institutional side of this story also includes the Hall of Fame dimension. Holyfield was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 2017. The Hall of Fame induction is the sport's formal acknowledgement of career achievement, the institutional statement that a fighter's contribution to boxing is permanent and worthy of permanent honor. For Holyfield, the induction came in the context of a financial situation that made the honor feel bittersweet to many observers. You cannot deposit a Hall of Fame plaque, but the induction matters in a way that goes beyond the symbolic. It is the sport saying that regardless of what happened in the years after the ring, regardless of the bankruptcy, the foreclosures, the legal battles, the diminished circumstances, the achievement stands. The fights happened. The belts were won. He is the only world heavyweight champion to win belts on 4 separate occasions. 4 times. In the hardest sport there is. That record is in the books, and no bankruptcy filing changes it. The relationship between achievement and its material rewards is one that Holyfield's story interrogates with particular force. He achieved more than almost anyone who has ever competed in his sport. The material rewards that those achievements generated were enormous. The connection between the achievement and the material rewards proved, in the end, to be fragile, subject to the forces of lifestyle inflation, financial mismanagement, and structural exploitation, in ways that the achievement itself was not. The achievement is permanent. The money was not. The broader sports media landscape has played a role in shaping the public understanding of Holyfield's story. The fall from grace documentary genre, YouTube videos with titles like How Evander Holyfield Lost Everything, or The Rise and Fall of Evander Holyfield, has generated millions of views and kept his story in public circulation long after the events themselves. These productions vary in quality and accuracy, but their collective impact has been to establish a particular narrative frame, the champion who had it all and lost it all. That frame is not inaccurate, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. By focusing on the dramatic arc, the $230 million and the $1 million as bookends, these productions tend to underweight the structural factors and overweight the individual ones. They make for compelling content because individual failure is more emotionally engaging than structural critique. But they contribute to a public understanding that locates the problem entirely in Holyfield's choices, rather than in the system within which those choices were made. A more complete understanding, the one this video aims to provide, requires holding both things simultaneously. Yes, Holyfield made decisions that, in retrospect, were costly and avoidable. And yes, the sport and the financial ecosystem around it were structured in ways that made those decisions more likely and more consequential than they needed to be. Both things are true. Neither cancels the other. And the lessons worth drawing from the story require engaging with both. The athlete financial literacy movement, such as it is, has made some progress in the years since Holyfield's story became a widely known cautionary tale. Some states have introduced legislation requiring financial education for professional athletes who compete within their jurisdictions. Some promotional organizations have voluntarily introduced financial planning resources for their fighters. Some major boxing events now include financial literacy components in the training camps and promotional events that surround them. These are incremental steps, and they are welcome, but they are not equivalent to the kind of institutional reform that would be required to meaningfully change the outcome for the next generation of boxers who achieve Holyfield's level of commercial success. That reform would require something that the sport's power structure is not currently motivated to provide: a mandatory, independent, and comprehensively funded financial protection system for fighters that is not controlled by the promoters and managers whose interests are served by fighters' financial vulnerability. Until that reform happens, the pattern will continue. The next generation of Holyfields, the fighters who will earn $50 million or $100 million in a single night on a streaming platform, who will build lifestyles and families and business ventures around those earnings, will face the same structural vulnerabilities. Some of them will navigate those vulnerabilities successfully. Others will follow the same arc, and the "how they lost it all" videos will be made about them too, and will generate millions of views, and will prompt the same conversations about individual responsibility and systemic failure that Holyfield's story has been prompting for the better part of 2 decades. The Don King era's end does not mean the structural problems ended with it. The promotional landscape of modern boxing is more fragmented than it was in the 1990s, but the fundamental power imbalances remain. Today's major promoters, Top Rank, Matchroom, Premier Boxing Champions, operate with similar structural advantages over the fighters they promote. The information asymmetries, the long-term exclusive contracts, the back-end arrangements that are not fully transparent to the fighter. These persist across the industry in modified forms in the digital streaming era. The boxer who earns $20 million in 2026 faces essentially the same structural challenges that Holyfield faced when he was earning $35 million in 1997. The amounts are different, the platforms are different, the specific individuals involved are different. The underlying architecture, the absence of collective representation, the lack of mandatory financial education, the structural misalignment between promoter incentives and fighter well-being is essentially the same. This is why Holyfield's story remains relevant and resonant in 2026. Nearly 3 decades after the peak of his career, it is not merely a historical curiosity about a famous athlete's financial choices. It is a live, ongoing description of a system that continues to produce the same outcomes, with the same human costs, in each successive generation of the sport's competitors. The question of what boxing owes its fighters is one that the sport has never adequately answered. The sport generates billions of dollars in revenue annually. The fighters who generate that revenue, who take the irreversible physical risks, who sacrifice their health and their bodies, and in some cases their neurological futures, receive a fraction of the value they create, distributed through arrangements that prioritize everyone else in the chain. Other industries have resolved, at least partially, the question of what entities owe the people whose labor creates value. Labor law, collective bargaining, workers' compensation, pension requirements. Boxing has largely opted out of these mechanisms. The sport's regulatory structure is fragmented across state and national jurisdictions, and the sport's cultural resistance to anything that looks like collective action among fighters, the individualism that defines the athlete and the sport, makes the political organizing required for reform particularly challenging. But the cost of that opt-out is paid by the fighters. It is paid by Evander Holyfield, who earned $230 million and ended up with $1 million. It is paid by every fighter who came before him and every fighter who will come after him. And it is paid in currency, both financial and physical, that cannot be refunded. One of the most valuable things about Holyfield's willingness to discuss his financial story honestly is the precedent it sets for other athletes. The shame that typically attaches to financial failure creates a strong incentive for athletes in his position to stay silent about what happened, to avoid the specifics, to present a version of events that is less honest and less useful. Holyfield has not done that. His willingness to discuss his mistakes publicly has helped other athletes avoid similar pitfalls. This is not a trivial contribution. The fighter who stands up in front of a group of young boxers and says, "I earned $230 million, and I ended up with $1 million, and here is why, and here is what I would do differently." That fighter is providing a service that no financial literacy course or management seminar can fully replicate. He is providing the testimony of lived experience with all the credibility that only direct experience confers. That testimony is part of his legacy now. Not the championship belts, or not only the championship belts, not the Tyson knockdowns, not the ear, not the mansion on Holyfield Highway, but the willingness, in the years that followed all of those things, to tell the truth about what happened to claim responsibility for the choices that were his to claim, and to use the story as something that can benefit people who are not yet in the position to know what they will eventually need to know. The systemic story also has a racial dimension that cannot be entirely avoided, earning extraordinary sums at the production end of the sports economy, while the ownership, promotional, and management structures that capture the majority of the value generated by their performances. This pattern is not unique to boxing, but it is particularly pronounced in boxing, where the production and capture of value are most clearly separated. Joe Louis's relationship with the IRS and with the promoters who managed his career. Muhammad Ali's financial arrangements across his career. Mike Tyson's management by Don King. Evander Holyfield's story. These are not coincidences. They are data points in a pattern that reflects the broader structure of American commercial sport. Acknowledging this dimension of the story is not about assigning blame to any individual. It is about accurately describing the environment in which these financial stories unfold, and about understanding why the pattern persists. Until the structural factors are named and addressed, the pattern will continue to produce the same outcomes, generation after generation. The international dimension of Holyfield's career adds another layer to the story. Boxing is a global sport, but the financial architecture of major championship bouts is predominantly American, and the legal and regulatory frameworks that govern fighter compensation are predominantly American as well. International fights. The Nikolai Valuev fight in Zurich, the Sultan Ibragimov fight in Moscow, are conducted under different regulatory regimes, with different financial arrangements and different protections for the fighters. When Holyfield was fighting internationally in the later stages of his career, when the $600,000 paydays and the $1 million paydays were the going rate, he was operating outside the major American promotional ecosystem that had produced his most lucrative fights. He was, in effect, taking whatever was available, wherever it was available, because the American market that had once offered him $35 million nights had moved on. The international fights were the financial fallback of a career in its declining years, and they came with none of the protections that the American regulatory system, however inadequate, provided. This is the final stage of the pattern for boxers in Holyfield's position. The peak fights, on the major American stages, for the big money, then the declining fights, on smaller stages for smaller money, then the international fights, on whatever stages will have you, for whatever they will pay, and then the exhibition fights, the Belfort fight at 58, for $500,000, which are the end point of a process that began when the fighter should have retired but could not afford to. The system that built Evander Holyfield is the same system that drained him. This is the deepest truth in the story, and it is the one that is hardest to sit with. The sport of boxing, the sport that gave a kid from Bowen Homes a path out, that channeled his extraordinary natural gifts into a vehicle for social mobility, that made him one of the most famous and celebrated athletes in the world, is the same sport that did not protect him when the earning was done, that created the conditions for his financial exploitation, and that permitted a 58-year-old man to step through the ropes against an active martial artist, because the financial safety net that should have existed simply did not. This is not a reason to condemn boxing. It is a reason to demand better from it. The sport is capable of generating the wealth required to fund adequate financial education, adequate pension support, adequate health care for former fighters dealing with the long-term neurological consequences of their careers. The question is not whether the resources exist. The question is whether the will to use them for the benefit of fighters, rather than for the benefit of everyone else in the chain, can be summoned. Evander Holyfield's story makes that question impossible to look away from. It makes it personal, specific, and human in a way that abstract arguments about institutional reform cannot. It is the story of a man who earned $230 million and ended up with $1 million, and whose story deserves to be the last such story the sport produces, not the latest in an endless series. The system story brings us, finally, to the question of what accountability looks like. Not accountability in the legal sense. The courts have already had their say on the bankruptcy filings and the child support arrears and the foreclosure proceedings, but accountability in the moral and institutional sense. The acknowledgement that the financial outcome of Evander Holyfield's career represents a failure that is not his alone to bear. Holyfield's experience highlights a common theme in sports. Athletes may struggle with money management post-career, but it also underscores the possibility of financial recovery. The possibility of recovery is real, and Holyfield has found it. But the necessity of recovery, the fact that a man who earned $230 million needed to recover from financial ruin in the first place, is not simply a commentary on his choices. It is a commentary on a system that should have prevented the ruin, and did not. The system and the sport that built Evander Holyfield owe him, and owe every fighter who follows him, better than what he received. That debt cannot be paid retroactively, but it can be paid forward through the reforms that his story makes necessary and the lessons it makes unmistakable. Whether the sport will choose to pay it is the open question that his story leaves behind. So what really happened to Evander Holyfield? We've been through the career, the mansion, the battles, and the system. We've examined the numbers from every angle and traced the money through every channel. Now it is time to assemble the verdict, to say plainly and completely what the totality of this story actually means. Here is the honest answer. Evander Holyfield earned over $230 million in a boxing career that spanned 30 years, and he ended up with approximately $1 million. That is a reduction in wealth of more than 99% from the peak. It is one of the most dramatic financial declensions in sports history, matched only by a handful of other athletes whose stories run on parallel tracks. Joe Louis, Mike Tyson, Oscar de la Hoya in some respects. And it happened not because of any single catastrophic event, not because of any one person's treachery or any one decision's wrongness, but because of a convergence of factors that operated simultaneously over an extended period. The factors are by now familiar. The mansion that consumed $1 million a year to maintain, the failed businesses, the record label, the television network venture, that absorbed capital without generating returns, the 3 divorces and their settlements, the 11 children and the child support obligations that ran into the hundreds of thousands per month at their peak, the advisors who enabled rather than protected, the accountants who were fired for telling the truth, the yes men who replaced them, the extended career driven partly by financial need and partly by the psychological impossibility of accepting that it was over. The structural vulnerabilities of a sport that does not protect its fighters after the earning is done, all of it operating together for 2 decades. But here's what also happened to Evander Holyfield. And this part of the story deserves equal weight. He survived. He is still here. He is, by any reasonable account of what survival means for a man who has been through what he has been through, doing remarkably well. Not wealthy, not comfortable in the way that $230 million should have provided, but stable, present, purposeful, connected to his faith, his family, his community, and the sport that made him. As of 2026, Evander Holyfield's net worth is estimated to be $1 million. $1 million. That is not nothing. For most people on Earth, it represents far more security than they will ever have. For a man who once had over $100 million, it represents the end point of a very long fall, but it also represents the foundation, modest, stable, honest, of a life rebuilt after catastrophe. The rebuilding matters. It matters because it demonstrates the same essential quality that built the fortune in the first place. The refusal to give up, the ability to absorb loss and continue moving, the conviction that the next round can be won even when the current one has gone badly. Evander Holyfield has not rebuilt to $100 million. He has not recovered the mansion or the cars or the memorabilia, but he has rebuilt to something, and something is the beginning of everything. The redemption arc in Holyfield's story is not the kind of redemption that makes for a satisfying Hollywood ending. It is not the story of a man who lost everything, learned his lesson, found a brilliant financial advisor, made 3 smart investments, and recovered his fortune. That is not what happened. The financial recovery is modest, practical, and ongoing. Appearance fees, endorsement deals, charity work, mentorship roles, the work of a man who is earning what is available to him at this stage of his life and career. As of 2019, Holyfield was earning about $1.2 million a year, mostly through personal appearances. $1 million a year in personal appearance fees. The income of a man whose name and presence still have commercial value, whose story still draws audiences, whose legacy still commands respect in the rooms where boxing is discussed and celebrated. It is not the income of a world champion at peak earning power, but it is the income of a man who has turned the raw material of his life story into a sustainable livelihood. The sustainability is the achievement, not the glamour, not the enormous sums. The quiet, ongoing act of maintaining a viable financial life in the aftermath of a financial catastrophe, through the simple and unglamorous work of showing up and being the person whose story people want to hear. That is what Evander Holyfield is doing in the later years of his life, and it deserves recognition as a form of resilience that is just as real as the resilience he showed in the ring. The faith dimension of his post-career life is inseparable from everything else. From the very beginning, from the press conferences before the Tyson fights where he assembled his team for prayer, from the faith healer in Philadelphia who he credited with curing his heart, from the statements he made at his retirement that were soaked in scriptural language. Faith has been the organizing principle of Holyfield's identity, not a Sunday morning add-on. The actual architecture of his interior life. At his 1994 retirement press conference, Holyfield said, "When Dr. Stevens told me it was an easy decision, I'm going to miss boxing a lot, but I believe God put boxing in my life for a reason. I had a lot of love for it, and it made a better life for me and my family." That statement was made at the lowest professional point of his first career phase, the point at which a heart condition had forced him out of the sport, when the next chapter was completely uncertain. And still the frame was gratitude. Still the frame was purpose. Still the frame was faith. The same frame has governed the financial chapter. Not denial. Holyfield has been too honest about what happened for denial to be an operative mechanism, but acceptance. And within acceptance, the search for meaning and purpose that faith enables. The financial loss was real. The hurt was real. And the life that has been built on the other side of it is real, grounded in something that the money, when it existed, was never able to fully provide. The mentorship work is, in the fullest sense, the continuation of everything he always was. Outside boxing, Holyfield has contributed to his community through charity work and mentorship. He's involved with youth programs in Atlanta and speaks at schools about perseverance and making smart choices. This is not a retirement hobby. This is a man applying the totality of his experience, the rise and the fall, the victories and the losses, the millions earned and the millions lost, to the formation of the next generation. Think about what he brings to those school gymnasium conversations. He is not a motivational speaker in the abstract sense, a person who talks about success from the safety of never having truly failed. He is a man who has been the best in the world at something, who has had everything and lost almost all of it, and who has found a way to continue on the other side. The young people in those gymnasiums, the ones growing up in circumstances not entirely unlike the ones he grew up in, are not hearing from someone who has been theoretically successful. They are hearing from someone who has lived through the full arc of what success and its consequences actually look like. That testimony is not available for purchase. You cannot download it. It is only available from a man who has lived it. And Evander Holyfield is one of the very few people in the world who has lived exactly this version of it. The question of whether the financial collapse constitutes a failure depends entirely on what you think Holyfield was responsible for. If you believe that an individual is solely responsible for every financial outcome in his life, that the systems and structures and advisors and institutional failures are simply the background, then yes, Holyfield failed. He made choices that a more financially sophisticated person would not have made, and the consequences of those choices are the financial reality he lives in today. But if you believe, as the evidence strongly suggests, that the outcomes of individual financial decisions are shaped by the systems within which those decisions are made, that a sport which does not protect its fighters from financial exploitation has created conditions in which failure is structurally likely, then the accounting looks very different. Then Holyfield is not primarily a cautionary tale about individual irresponsibility. He is primarily a case study in what happens when extraordinary talent meets an inadequate support structure. Both readings are partially correct. The honest verdict holds both simultaneously, without collapsing the complexity into a simple moral lesson. Holyfield made choices that cost him, and the systems around him failed him in ways that made those choices more likely and more costly than they needed to be. Both things are true, and both things matter. The verdict on the specific question of the title. What really happened to Evander Holyfield is this: a man from a housing project in Atlanta, with gifts so exceptional that they carried him from poverty to the absolute summit of the hardest sport in the world, accumulated $230 million over 30 years of professional competition. That accumulation was eroded by a lifestyle that outran his income, by businesses that consumed capital without generating returns, by family obligations that were real and numerous and expensive, by advisors who enabled rather than protected, by a sport structured to extract rather than preserve the value he created, and by the same iron refusal to accept limits that had made him a champion. He lost most of what he built. He filed for bankruptcy. He was threatened with imprisonment over child support. He stepped through the ropes at 58 against an active martial artist because the alternative was not having enough. He sold his Olympic bronze medal to pay his debts. The road sign still bears his name. The man at the end of that road was no longer who he had been. And then he kept going, because that is what Evander Holyfield has always done. He has always kept going. When the heart diagnosis came, he kept going. When the Bo losses came, he kept going. When the Tyson ear incident came, he kept going. When the foreclosure came, when the bankruptcy came, when the auction of the Olympic medal came, he kept going. The specific modality of the going has changed. The direction of the going has changed, but the fundamental quality, the refusal to stop, the will to continue, the faith that the next round can be won, that quality has not changed. It was there at the beginning. It is there now. The parallel story of his son Evan is a thread that runs through the later years of the Holyfield narrative, and that connects the beginning of the story to its present. A young man named Evan Holyfield, carrying his father's name, his father's jaw structure, his father's boxing lineage, pursuing the same career that made his father famous, facing some of the same obstacles that nearly ended his father's career before it fully began. Reports emerged about Evan Holyfield requiring open-heart surgery, with his mother subsequently opening up about him getting back into the gym. The mirroring is almost unbearable in its clarity. Father and son, generations apart, both confronting the possibility that the sport they love might be taken away by the body's refusal to cooperate. Both apparently refusing to accept that possibility. Both finding their way back. What is Evander Holyfield's role in that story? He is the father who has been through everything. Who knows, from the inside, what it costs to be a champion in this sport, what it costs to maintain that status, and what it costs when the sport is over and the money is gone. If his experience has produced wisdom that he has been able to pass to his son, wisdom about both the fighting and the financial aftermath, then the suffering was not entirely without product. Then the story of the mansion and the bankruptcy and the sold Olympic medal has generated something useful that carries forward into the next chapter. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, a form of legacy that money cannot buy. The public reaction to Evander Holyfield in 2026 is characterized by something that is harder to sustain than admiration or criticism. It is characterized by genuine affection, the kind of affection that is earned over decades of watching someone compete with extraordinary courage, lose with dignity, and rebuild without complaint. The kind of affection that does not require a happy ending, that can hold the sadness of the financial story and the respect for the fighting story simultaneously, without needing to resolve the tension between them. This affection is visible in the way boxing commentators speak about him in retrospective segments. It is visible in the Reddit threads where people discuss his career and his collapse with a protective tenderness. That is not the register most Reddit discussions operate in. It is visible in the YouTube comment sections under the tribute videos. The comments from people who grew up watching the Tyson fights, for whom Holyfield's story is part of the texture of their childhood memories, who feel the financial loss as something personal, even though they never met the man. Evander Holyfield is beloved in the genuine, complicated sense of that word. Not worshipped, not uncritically celebrated. Beloved in the way that people love someone whose story they know fully, whose flaws and failures they have witnessed alongside the achievements, and who they have chosen to continue caring about through all of it. The Real Deal nickname carries more meaning now than it did when it was bestowed at the height of his commercial success. When the nickname was given, it meant something simple. This is a real fighter, a genuine article, a champion who backs up everything the marketing promises with actual performance in the ring. Real, as opposed to manufactured. A deal, as in the deal is exactly what it says on the package. Now, decades later, with everything that has happened between the nickname's bestowal and today, the phrase resonates differently. Real, as in honest about what happened. Real, as in present and accountable, and not hiding from the story. Real, as in still here, still engaged, still investing in the next generation, even from a position of material modesty. A deal, as in the deal between a man and his own values, the deal that survives when the mansion is gone and the money is gone, and what's left is just the person and what they actually stand for. That deal has held, whatever else went wrong, whatever choices were made poorly, whatever systems failed, and whatever trust was betrayed. The fundamental deal between Evander Holyfield and his own character has held. He is still, recognizably, the person who emerged from Bowen Homes with something to prove and proved it beyond any reasonable expectation. The ledger is lighter than it should be. The man is still intact. The financial cautionary tale aspect of this story, the part that gets the most traffic on YouTube, the most discussion on Reddit, the most citation in financial literacy circles, is real and important. Evander Holyfield's net worth of $1 million to $2 million tells a story of both triumph and cautionary tale. From earning over $230 million to filing bankruptcy, then rebuilding a modest fortune, his financial journey covers the full spectrum of possibilities. His experience demonstrates that making money is only half the battle. Keeping it requires different skills entirely. That lesson, making money is only half the battle, is one of the most practically valuable things that the Holyfield story teaches, and it is one that has genuine application outside the sports world. The specific mechanisms of his financial decline are not unique to boxers or athletes. Lifestyle inflation beyond income, trust in advisors without adequate oversight, multiple simultaneous financial obligations, failure to plan for the inevitable decline of peak earnings. These are patterns that play out in the lives of high earners in many industries, at many scales. The fact that Holyfield's version of these patterns played out at the scale of $230 million makes it visible and discussable, in a way that smaller scale versions are not, but the underlying dynamics are universal. Is living a smaller version of the same story. Holyfield's version is simply the most dramatic and most thoroughly documented of those versions that the world has had the opportunity to observe. The legacy question is, ultimately, the most important one. What is Evander Holyfield's legacy? How should the world remember and evaluate this man, this career, this life? The sporting legacy is clear and unambiguous. He is known for his remarkable career, becoming the undisputed champion in both the cruiserweight and heavyweight divisions. Holyfield is the only boxer to win a version of the heavyweight championship 4 separate times. 4 times. No one else has done it. Not Ali, not Louis, not Foreman, not Tyson. 4 times, Evander Holyfield took the most contested title in sports and put it around his waist. That accomplishment stands regardless of everything that came after it. He is ranked by the Ring magazine's list of greatest punchers of all time, ranked 91st in BoxRec's ranking of the greatest pound-for-pound boxers of all time, and Boxing Scene ranked him the greatest cruiserweight of all time. The greatest cruiserweight of all time. A top 100 pound-for-pound fighter in the history of the entire sport. A man who won titles in 3 separate decades, the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s. A feat that speaks to the longevity and the sustained excellence of his competitive career. The human legacy is harder to define but equally real. The boy who walked out of Bowen Homes and into the boxing gym at the boys' club and decided that the life available to him in that project was not the life he was going to live. The young man who competed at the Olympics and was controversially denied the gold medal he earned, and responded not with bitterness, but with determination. The athlete who was told his career was over by the best medical opinion available and came back to beat Mike Tyson twice. The champion who earned more money than most people can imagine and lost almost all of it and kept going. These are the chapters of a human story that defies easy characterization. It is not a success story in the conventional sense, because success in the conventional sense would include financial security. It is not a failure story, because the failure is too partial and the recovery too real for that framing to hold. It is, more accurately, a story about what happens when extraordinary gifts meet ordinary human vulnerabilities, when the qualities that produce greatness in one domain are insufficient to protect against the risks present in others. The human legacy, in the end, is about resilience as a way of life, not resilience as an inspirational poster concept, but resilience in the exhausting, unglamorous, year-after-year sense. The resilience of a man who gets up every morning with $1 million to his name where there once was 100 million, and does the work that is available to him, and maintains his faith, and mentors the next generation, and carries his story honestly without reducing it to a lesson or inflating it into a myth. The verdict on the title question, "What really happened to Evander Holyfield?" is now complete. It is not a mystery, it is not a conspiracy. It is not the result of any single person's malice or any single decision's catastrophic wrongness. It is the result of a man who earned an extraordinary fortune, who was failed by the systems that should have protected it, who made choices that compounded the failures, who continued fighting long past the point of wisdom, because the financial alternative was worse than the physical risk, and who ultimately lost nearly everything that the money had built, and then kept going. That is the verdict. That is what really happened. The going and the keeping of it. His journey shows that even immense earnings can disappear without structure, discipline, and foresight. Yet, it also reveals a fighter's spirit. He continues to rebuild, inspire, and turn his name into value, even decades after his prime. That fighter's spirit is the irreducible residue of the story. The championship belts can be forfeited. The mansion can be foreclosed. The Olympic medal can be sold. The fighter's spirit, that quality that propelled a kid from Bowen Homes through 30 years of the hardest sport in the world, that does not go to auction. That stays. The story of Evander Holyfield in 2026 is quieter than any earlier chapter of his life. There is no arena, no roar of the crowd, no championship belt, no mansion, no entourage. There is a man in Atlanta, the city that named a highway after him, that commissioned a statue for him, that shaped him in its most desperate housing project, and then celebrated him on its biggest stages, living a life that is modest by the standards of his peak, and rich by the standards of his origins. He speaks at events, he attends boxing shows, he advises young fighters, he maintains the Holyfield Foundation's youth programs. He is currently a boxing advisor to heavyweight prospect Zhang Zhilei. He is a grandfather. He is a man of faith. He is still, by most accounts, the same person he was in the ring, present, focused, and working with whatever is in front of him. That is not nothing. In a world that tends to define people by the peaks of their achievement and the depths of their failure, the fact that Evander Holyfield at 63 is still engaged, still contributing, still the recognizable continuation of the person he always was, that is genuinely something. Not what the $230 million might have bought, but something. The lessons of this story are worth stating directly, because they have earned the directness. For athletes entering high-earning careers, financial literacy is not optional. The skills that make you elite in your sport will not automatically translate into financial protection. The people who want to help you with your money have their own interests, which are not always the same as yours. The infrastructure for protecting what you earn must be built deliberately and maintained independently, with advisors who are legally obligated to prioritize your interests over their own. For the institutions of sport, the pattern of champions going broke is not an individual failure that recurs across generations. It is a systemic failure that should be addressed systemically. Mandatory financial education, independent financial oversight, transparent disclosure of promotional arrangements, and long-term support for retired athletes are not radical proposals. They are the minimum that a sport generating billions of dollars in annual revenue owes the people whose bodies generate that revenue. For everyone else, the The story of Evander Holyfield is a study in the difference between income and wealth, between peak earning and long-term security, between the trust that generosity extends and the protection that prudence requires. These are lessons that apply at every income level, in every industry, across every era. The scale of Holyfield's story makes them visible. The universality of the underlying dynamics makes them relevant to everyone listening. The final thing to be said about Evander Holyfield is the one that is hardest to quantify, but most essential to acknowledge. He made it out of Bowen Homes. He made it out of the kind of poverty and the kind of environment that statistically does not produce Olympians and world champions. He earned $230 million with his hands and his heart. He lost most of it through a combination of his own choices and other people's failures, and the structural inadequacies of a sport that was not designed to protect him. And then he kept going, quietly, modestly, honestly, faithfully. Not with the fanfare of the peak years, not with the resources he once commanded, not with the recognition he deserves for the totality of what he has been through and what he has survived, but with the same fundamental quality that made him remarkable from the beginning. The quality that no courtroom can foreclose, no auction can sell, no bankruptcy can discharge. Resilience, the most essential asset, the one he never lost, the one that in the final accounting turns out to have been the only one that truly mattered. Evander Holyfield is not a tragedy. He is a story, a long, complicated human story that contains tragedy within it, but is not reducible to it. The tragedy is real. $230 million, and 1 million remains. The triumph is equally real. Bowen Homes to the summit of the hardest sport in the world, to a life rebuilt from ruin on the foundation of faith and will. Both things are true. Both things are part of who he is and what his story means. The people who watch the how he lost everything videos and feel only sadness are missing half the story. The people who watch them and feel only admiration for his resilience are also missing half the story. The full story requires both feelings simultaneously, the grief for what was lost and the respect for what was saved, the indictment of the systems that failed him, and the acknowledgement of the choices that cost him, the sadness of the Olympic medal sold at auction and the recognition of the man who sold it and kept going. That full story is what this video has tried to tell, not the version that flatters anyone or condemns anyone or reduces a human life to a lesson, the real version. The one that honors the complexity and the humanity of a man who was, for better and for worse, the real deal in every sense of the word. The road sign on Evander Holyfield Highway is still there. The property at the end of it belongs to someone else now. The statue in downtown Atlanta stands in the neighborhood that shaped the man it commemorates. He is the first boxer to hold world titles in 3 separate decades: the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s. 3 decades. That is the unambiguous, permanent, unassailable record. Whatever else the story contains, whatever else the balance sheet says, whatever else the courtrooms decided, and the auctions produced, that record is real. Holyfield retired with a record of 44 wins, 10 losses, and 2 draws. Out of his 44 wins, 29 were by knockout. 44 wins, 29 knockouts, 4 heavyweight championships, undisputed cruiserweight champion, bronze medalist at the 1984 Olympics, Hall of Famer, the only man to do what he did, the way he did it, across the span of time he did it. No bankruptcy filing changes any of that. No foreclosure touches it. It is simply, permanently his. What really happened to Evander Holyfield is that he won, and then he lost, and then he kept going. That is the full story. That is the real deal. One more thing. In all of the discussions of financial literacy and systemic failure and structural exploitation, in all of the important, necessary conversations that Holyfield's story makes possible, it is easy to lose sight of the thing that started all of this. The thing that made the $230 million possible. The thing that put a kid from the Bowen Homes projects on the Olympic stage, and then on the biggest stages in the world. Holyfield's career is defined by resilience and determination, qualities that earned him the nickname, the real deal. His willingness to fight through adversity, both inside and outside the ring, has inspired countless fans and athletes. That inspiration is real. It is not diminished by the financial story. It is not conditional on the net worth figure. The inspiration that Evander Holyfield's life and career provides to people who are coming from difficult circumstances, who are told they are too small, or too limited, or too something. That inspiration is the most durable thing he built, more durable than the mansion, more permanent than the championship belts. The boy from Bowen Homes became the heavyweight champion of the world 4 times. That happened, and nothing that came after it. Not the foreclosure, not the bankruptcy, not the child support battles, not the 58-year-old man stepping through the ropes against Vitor Belfort, changes the fact that it happened. Evander Holyfield did what he set out to do. He proved in the most public and unambiguous way available to him that where you start does not determine where you end up, that the people who say you can't are not always right, that faith and will and the refusal to quit can carry you further than anyone who looks at your circumstances would ever predict. That is what really happened to Evander Holyfield. All of it. Every single part.